Did you grow up drag racing as a nightmare fuel SpongeBob, marching behind David Bowie in a G-string, and recreating the most iconic moments from SpongeBob's first 10 years? If so, you're probably nostalgic for SpongeBob games just like me. After a long hard day of work in 2025, there's nothing better than coming home, cracking open a cold hard Bobby, and playing a few hours of the Bob. Well, at least that's the case for some of the games.
I was just looking for the sports channel, Gary.
In part 1 of my journey to play and rank every SpongeBob game, we went through what I would call the classic era of SpongeBob video game history. We had an all-time great with Battle for Bikini Bottom, as well as genuine bangers like the movie game and Revenge of the Flying Dutchman, which might be a little bit controversial, and even Lights Camera Pants was a bunch of fun. Most of the handheld games kinda sucked in this era, but none were bad enough to put into F tier. We're starting to enter some uncharted waters for me though. While I'd played most of the games in part 1 a bunch in my childhood, there isn't a single game I'm ranking today that I've had prior experience with. In fact, I've barely heard anybody talk about most of these games before, so I'm truly going in blind here. Today we'll be covering everything from Creature from the Krusty Krab, all the way up to SpongeBob's Boating Bash. Big SpongeBob and Nick fans will notice that this is the era where they start basing a lot of the SpongeBob games on the TV specials that were being pumped out at the time. Atlantis, SquarePantis, SpongeBob vs. the Big One, and Truth or Square were all released alongside TV specials of the same name. It makes a whole lot of sense from a marketing perspective, but I kinda hate it. I love that Revenge of the Flying Dutchman and Battle for Bikini Bottom had complete creative license to make their own story, and they weren't handcuffed to any pre-existing narratives. I feel like it always makes for a better game when a developer isn't trying to make a game at the same time a studio is also trying to develop an episode or a movie. As always, I'll be playing every unique version of these games, reviewing them, and then ranking them to see what is the best and worst SpongeBob game of all time. Will we see our first F tier SpongeBob game? Will any game be able to join Battle for Bikini Bottom in S tier? Let's dive in. But first, I've got some huge news. Cartoon Review is now on Patreon. To celebrate hitting 10,000 subscribers, I've launched the official Cartoon Review Patreon, where you can support the channel for as little as $3 per month. There are a bunch of different tiers and perks, including early and ad-free access to my videos, your name in the credits, shoutouts, behind the scenes content, access to my upcoming video schedule, and even the chance to help me decide what topics I cover in the future. Also, if you don't want to pay a cent, you can also join for free to grab my monthly newsletter, The Absolution Log. Of course, just subscribing, watching, liking, commenting, and hyping the video if you're on mobile is a massive way to support the channel. But if you have some extra dollars to throw my way to help keep the channel running, it'd be massively appreciated. And I have to give a huge shout out to Christopher Gunderson, who has already signed up as a Patreon producer. He signed up at the Punch Time Explosion tier, which allowed him to choose the slimy world of Teen Nick games as the next video I'll be focusing on. If you'd like to support me, head to patreon.com/cartoonreview to learn more, or click the link in the description. But enough of that, let's get back to ranking every SpongeBob game. After genuinely changing the game when it comes to licensed video games, Heavy Iron Studios have said goodbye to the SpongeBob franchise, and instead we've got Blitz Games at the helm. Get used to this because a lot of the SpongeBob home console games are developed by them from here on out. Heavy Iron will return for Truth or Square, but for now they're pumping out Pixar tie-in games. Creature from the Krusty Krab is such a bizarre game first up from Blitz Games. It came out almost 2 years after the last SpongeBob home console game, but don't let that fool you. 2 years were absolutely not spent on this. Instead, Blitz Games met with THQ during E3 2005, where they were asked to oversee the SpongeBob franchise on home consoles going forward. With Creature from the Krusty Krab releasing on October 18 of the following year, it was basically developed on the standard 1-year timeline that THQ loved. Reviews for this one were all over the place. Scores were in the mid-50s for the Wii and PS2 versions, but the GameCube version was in the mid-70s. All versions are fundamentally the same, with the Wii having motion controls obviously. In fact, the GameCube is the one game with notable differences, as it looks notably worse, and has by far the worst reputation for technical glitches. Why this version scored the highest, I have no idea. Remember when I said this was a bizarre game first up from Blitz Games? Well, I truly meant it. If you're like me and had never played Creature from the Krusty Krab as a kid and were only familiar with the 3D platformers, you're probably expecting more of the same here. After all, Blitz only had a year to develop the game, so surely they stick to the same formula. Well, that couldn't be further from the case here. This is the most bizarre game seen in the SpongeBob franchise to date. The strangeness begins from the moment you hit start and does not let up for a moment. The story kicks off by showing that the game is centered around the character's dreams. For example, SpongeBob's opening levels are all centered around him dreaming about getting his boating license and drag racing his friends.
Let's ride!
SpongeBob immediately starts zooming around a racetrack in a hot rod where you're frequently collecting these Z tokens. These are littered around the game and are actually purely used to buy bonus content in the game's shop back at the main menu. You'll start picking these up out of habit during the game's pretty boring intro level. Honestly, it's one of the weirder introductions to a game. You then transition into the second level, where SpongeBob's boating license is running away from you, which leads you into a slightly more familiar 3D platformer level. One thing to note though is that while there are 3D platformer levels scattered throughout Creature from the Krusty Krab, they never quite hit the same way the other games did, and their structure rarely feels familiar to what was put together in those previous 3D platformers. Oh, and SpongeBob hits the gritty here, constantly. Like every single time anything happens.
I say right foot creep, walking with that heat.
Quickly, you'll start picking up these pink Patrick-shaped balloon things and these green plankton ones as well. These really look like balloons to me, but apparently they're actually sleepy seeds, whatever that is. When you grab your first one of these, the game lets you know that you need to collect these to unlock characters in the final level, but doesn't really elaborate. How crucial are these characters to the final level? Will I hit a roadblock like the Goofy Goober tokens if I don't collect them all?
I'm sorry, SpongeBob. You don't have enough Goofy Goober tokens.
I also quickly assumed that I'd only be unlocking Plankton and Patrick, as those were the only seeds I was finding. As for the core gameplay while SpongeBob is in his platforming levels, things are pretty basic. He can take 5 hits before dying, you've got a ground pound that can activate switches or be used as an attack, and there's also a dash that can similarly be used for combat or environmental puzzles. Interestingly, the game drip feeds abilities to you in the first platforming level. You literally can't use SpongeBob's regular attack until the game decides, hey, we're going to teach you how to press square now. You actually complete a whole level before they give you this. SpongeBob then has another racing section, this time racing against like a dark, f***ed up version of Patrick. But to me, this is just regular Patrick. In this race, Patrick tries to murder you with bombs as if he's spent way too long playing Crash Team Racing's boss battle against Pinstripe Potteroo.
What, you call that racing? Forget about it. If you's gonna race outside, you's gonna have to get past me first.
After this literal detour, you're back to platforming. And I've got to say, some of the objectives for SpongeBob are really uninspired here. Like, smash 50 crates? Really? That's the best we can do here? Not too impressed with where things are heading. Things are also super combat focused in SpongeBob's opening levels, at least until the game gives him the anchor swinging ability and then starts incorporating some more platforming. Unfortunately, a lot of the platforming is centered around this ability, and it just feels really clunky. Swinging from one anchor to the next never feels right. It's like the anchors are spaced really weirdly for how the game naturally flings SpongeBob forward, and jumping after these swings also just feels slightly off as well. It's kind of hard to properly explain, but every anchor section just feels janky. Not helping matters is that the camera can also be a touch fiddly here, which is never a good thing in a 3D platformer. And then we're back to drag racing. Side note, why does SpongeBob all of a sudden become super cracked out looking in these race segments? He's completely normal in the platforming segments, so it's very strange to see him all of a sudden become this deranged lunatic and then immediately switch back in the span of a couple loading screens. Ultimately, these driving segments are super dull. They're not really races because while they're framed like you're racing against somebody else, you actually just need to complete the 3 laps in a certain time limit. The other racer really doesn't have any bearing on things, even when they are dropping occasional hazards. The track isn't nearly wacky or chaotic enough to keep you entertained for a full 3 laps either. And overall, in these opening SpongeBob levels, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just really off about this game. It felt like I was playing a PS1 game. Everything felt very last gen. There were so many times I saw an environment and just thought, wow, this would look right at home as a PS1 environment. A lot of the environmental puzzles boil down to pushing blocks exactly where the game tells you to. Like, they literally have gigantic flashing arrows showing you what to do, which is super lame. The other environmental puzzles are usually just you pushing switches. Needless to say, things are off to a pretty rough start. The other big issue here, at least to start with, is that a cohesive narrative is non-existent. The game is carved up into SpongeBob, Patrick, and Plankton sections, and the beginning feels really disconnected. So while the rough gameplay was happening, I didn't even have a fun narrative pulling me through. At the end of SpongeBob's levels, he kind of just falls to his death, and we immediately transition to Patrick. As somebody going in blind, I kind of believed that this would be the absolute end of SpongeBob's section in the game. Moving on to Patrick's dream, this is all about him being a superhero. This comes with a new visual style, where everything is made to look like a comic book, but it just feels off. The style they went for here just feels cheap in the wrong way. They make a lot of things look like cardboard cutouts, and instead of feeling like an interesting design choice, it just gave me PS1 low budget vibes. Patrick is up against an evil version of himself here, and all of the bad guys' minions are also versions of Patrick. I get the thought process here, and it's kind of funny, especially when all of the NPCs you're saving are also Patrick, but at the same time there's a real dull sameness that comes in everything being Patrick. Patrick's abilities here are very similar to SpongeBob's, with the small change up being that instead of the anchor swinging, he can blow things. Sure, why not? These levels are almost entirely focused on combat, but you can't go more than a couple minutes without being interrupted here. It's particularly bad at the start where Patrick is constantly taking calls from these phone booths. At this point, I just wanted to play the damn game rather than being interrupted. Unsurprisingly, combat is very easy here. Nobody would ever say the combat in the previous 3D platformers was super challenging or deep, but somehow Blitz games have made this even more simple. For starters, you can literally just hold down square and your character will constantly repeat their attack. It also doesn't help that enemies just run up to you and are so slow to initiate an attack that they basically have no chance not to be mown down. So when Patrick's levels in this section pretty much only consist of this gameplay, it starts to get mind-numbing. You will get some light platforming and puzzle solving stuff, but this is in the absolute minority, and it's pretty meh just like the SpongeBob section, so it's hardly a saving grace or a breath of fresh air. Once you hold square to plow through all of these levels, Patrick will be shot into outer space, and you'll hard cut to Plankton's dream. This one caught my interest right away. Here, Plankton is being chased by a giant Krabby Patty, which results in you basically doing a side-scrolling platformer. It's not that fun, but it's kind of an interesting change-up compared to what had come before it. This section is also notably shorter than SpongeBob and Patrick's opening levels, which I'm kind of thankful for, because there's no way that these wouldn't have become incredibly tedious if they dragged on much longer. In between side-scrolling, you get served this weird mini-game where Plankton has to catch items without being spotted by the giant Krabby Patty. The mini-game itself is just kinda whatever, but at the end of it you find out that you're purely doing this to get extra Z tokens. Z tokens are honestly pretty damn worthless, so this was kind of disappointing. You can't fail these mini-games, so you're actually free to just put your controller down and doom scroll for a bit or whatever. Next section of levels picks up where SpongeBob's first section left off, with him falling and eventually being swallowed up by the Alaskan bullworm. I was pretty relieved that it seemed like there was at least some narrative continuity between each character's parts of the game, but at this point, I was still failing to see what the point of this narrative was. At this stage, we're literally not building anything. I'm not expecting a Shakespeare narrative in a SpongeBob game, but Revenge of the Flying Dutchman and Battle for Bikini Bottom at least had interesting plot beats that made me want to push the story along. Thankfully, these next levels are actually quite good. Blitz strikes a nice balance between platforming, combat, and puzzle solving. even if most of the puzzle solving is just turning these winches.
Now it's time to bring it around town. Bring it around town.
This is the closest the game ever comes to feeling like the previous 3D platformers. If the game had been entirely like this, it still wouldn't have been as good as any of those games, but it definitely would have been a million times better than what I've seen here so far. After going through the Alaskan bullworm's digestive system and flying to safety, we transition back to Patrick, who's still flying out into space. This is where the game really takes a hard turn. Everything in this section is built around you flying on this rocket. You're pushed into these on-rails sections where you're dodging objects and making sure the rocket gets refueled. This is incredibly boring. You really just float around dodging the occasional bit of debris, and every now and then you shoot something to open a door. The only saving grace is that the music during the bonus level here is pretty cool. Otherwise, this whole segment feels like a dull detour and just padding the game's length. We head back to Plankton again, and this time he has been supersized into a kaiju and has decided he wants to destroy stuff now. You stomp around here without much purpose. The game wants you to smash stuff, but this only grants you Z tokens, and in reality you can mostly just walk from A to B without doing much here. After this section, the dreams start converging into one. This came out 4 years before Inception, so Chris Nolan, you ain't slick, I know you played this game. SpongeBob flies out of the Alaskan bullworm and directly engages with Plankton, basically rehashing the flying levels from Patrick's last section. There's just way too many flying levels in this game. Like half the game is flying, and ignoring that it's not really fun, I just don't want to be flying planes and rockets in a SpongeBob game. It's just so not what SpongeBob is about. Also, while I was flying around in this section, there were randomly 2 kaiju plankton on screen at the same time, which was kind of weird. Eventually, Patrick comes crashing back to Earth and joins in the fight against Plankton, mercifully giving us a combat-focused section. Patrick fights through waves of Plankton's minions, who have just kind of showed up out of nowhere, but eventually you manage to zap Plankton with a shrink ray, and you get him back to his normal size. Then the game transitions to the final level. This is it, the big finale. This is what you were collecting all of those sleepy seeds for. And it's just another race section. And the sleepy seeds just allow you to choose a different racer. Cool. I cannot overstate how lame this is. You need to collect 27 unique sleepy seeds for both Plankton and Patrick to be unlocked here, but I have no idea why anybody would bother. I don't even know if it's possible to unlock them on your first playthrough, because I was still collecting sleepy seeds during this final race. Maybe there are more than 27 sleepy seeds across the game? It also just makes zero sense why you're racing here. Like, I get it's a dream sequence game, so everything is totally wacky, but seriously, what is the point of this? Once you finish the race, you get a super underwhelming ending. Just look at how static everything is in this cutscene at the Krusty Krab. It just oozes rushed and cheap vibes. There are actually 3 unique endings here, with one for Plankton and Patrick as well, that are only shown if you choose them for the final race. It gives slightly more motivation towards getting the sleepy seeds, but not that much. Once you finish the game, you're free to spend your Z tokens on this gacha machine that will randomly give you concept art, alternate costumes, or give you the ability to play the shitty minigames from the main game whenever you want. Yay. Now, one of the biggest criticisms leveled at this game is that it doesn't feel like a SpongeBob game. Going into this, it was literally the only thing I knew about Creature from the Krusty Krab, and I was kinda skeptical about that. When I saw it was a dream sequence game, I sort of understood where people were coming from, but I wasn't totally against this idea. I think this kind of premise can lead to some fun ideas. The main issue is that Blitz really just missed on the execution. I think one of the major things hurting this game's overall tone and feeling is the distinct lack of supporting characters. Outside of the main characters here, the only SpongeBob side characters that show up are Mrs. Puff and Old Man Jenkins of all people. Gary technically races against you at the start, and Sandy is a blink and you'll miss it cameo. I guess technically these crab enemies are supposed to be Mr. Krabs. The game doesn't have any trace of Squidward, unless you count this rock carving. It just feels wrong. Just because it's a dream sequence game doesn't mean it has to be entirely devoid and detached of the Bikini Bottom crew. I think the one saving grace in this game is that it does have some pretty great humor, and it has fun writing at times. Most of the cutscenes had me laughing, but it ultimately doesn't have the same charm and energy that the A and S tier games have had. This game wasn't spared being very bizarre when it came to visuals either. As I touched on, a lot of the time this feels like a PS1 game. It's kinda strange because Blitz just reused Heavy Iron's 3D models and a lot of assets from those games for this, so I'm not sure why levels often look so poor. This is a massive step back for SpongeBob games on the home console. There are also just so many bizarre visual moments scattered throughout the game. It definitely feels like a brand new developer was brought in who was strapped for time and was rushing to try and push something out the door.
Sorry about that.
Maybe my judgment was a little clouded by assuming this would be just another continuation of the 3D platformers we've seen so far for SpongeBob, but Creature from the Krusty Krab really caught me off guard, and not in a good way. It feels like a lot of the decisions here were made purely due to being under a time crunch, and it's resulted in a real mess of a game. Considering this was released in 2006, it's absolutely inexcusable that it feels like a PS1 game a lot of the time, and the entire thing just lacks soul. Despite only being around 5 hours long, it really overstays its welcome, and outside of a few decent at best levels, there's not a lot of fun to speak about here. This is easily a contender for the worst home console game so far, and I'm extremely tempted to drop it to F tier, but I think there's just enough going for it to reach D tier. Creature from the Krusty Krab marked the first time a SpongeBob 3D platformer, if you could even call it that, was adapted for the Nintendo DS. We'd previously seen Yellow Avenger as the first ever DS game for SpongeBob, however this was exclusively released on handhelds alongside a PSP version. This game was developed by WayForward. They'd become a bit of a go-to team for SpongeBob handheld titles, having made the SpongeBob movie and Lights Camera Pants on GBA, with both of those being straightforward but respectable C-tier 2D platformers. In terms of structure, this version follows the home console closely in terms of story, bouncing from character to character at the exact same times, and also varying up the gameplay to try and somewhat match what was being done on home console, but in a way that was kind of manageable for the DS. What is noticeably different is how the game's story is presented. As far as I can tell, this version had original animation in the style of the show made for the game's cutscenes. It's obviously pretty low res and slightly simplified due to being on the DS, but it's really like watching clips from the show. I know I just praised the cutscenes from the home console version, but knowing these exist, it kind of sucks that we didn't get to see these fully fleshed out on the home console version. Rewarding players with basically a full episode of the show, seeing as there's like 17 minutes of cutscenes, would have redeemed that game slightly. In-game, the visuals are a bit underwhelming. My initial reaction was that it gave off strong GBA vibes. Looking like a previous gen game is something it definitely shares in common with the home console version, and it's for good reason I felt like it was looking like a GBA version. The sprites in this are shared with the GBA version, which WayForward also developed. No doubt this was done to save time, and I don't think the game looks bad, but it is a bit underwhelming to see, especially considering Yellow Avenger did something vastly different with SpongeBob's DS debut. The gameplay couldn't be more different than the GBA game though, because this is entirely played via the touchscreen. Players need to swipe SpongeBob in the direction they want him to walk, and he'll start automatically moving. You can then swipe up to make him jump, or down to make him stop. SpongeBob's movement speed is rather slow, and early on you might find this a bit annoying, but trust me, as you get further into the game, you'll be thankful that he doesn't move any faster. While SpongeBob is moving along, he'll start pushing any large objects that are in his way, which is a very common puzzle solution here. You'll also find certain objects blocking your path that need to be tapped on to be removed, and you'll regularly be pulling on levers or spinning valves to open or activate things to keep SpongeBob moving forward. Combat in this game isn't really combat. You can stun enemies by tapping on them, and then if SpongeBob touches them, they'll immediately be dispatched. While it is a bit of an awkward and unfamiliar control scheme, I did find that the tutorial level does a solid job of introducing all of this to you, and I quickly went from being apprehensive about playing the entire game like this, to relatively comfortable. Sleepy seeds return here, but in the form of these dots that are scattered everywhere throughout levels. They also have no major importance in this version, so I've got no real idea why you would even go out of your way to collect them. Levels have occasional branching paths, but like the sleepy seeds, I'm not really sure what their point is. The only notable thing I found is that there is one branching path that has slightly more sleepy seeds compared to the alternative path. So yeah, we're just kind of stacking pointless additions on top of each other here. While I did quickly adapt to the controls and found that the so-called combat was pretty easy due to being able to tap enemies as soon as they appear on screen, some challenges did start to pop up. Namely, this is because you can only take 3 hits before dying, and way too often the game puts you in scenarios where you cannot avoid taking damage. It also doesn't help that early on, finding extra lives is incredibly rare. Once you wrap up SpongeBob's initial platforming levels, you'll get a driving section that is actually quite similar to the regular gameplay, but instead of scrolling horizontally, SpongeBob is now scrolling vertically. You still need to tap on obstacles and enemies to remove them. This section was really clunky. A lot of the time it felt like the game was actually moving SpongeBob on his own, and when it wasn't doing that, the whole thing still just felt really dull. Something similar then kicks off Patrick's section as he's scrolling along trying to clear a path for a train. Patrick is determined to punch the shit out of all the rocks here, but I was quickly finding that incredibly difficult. Like your health in the regular levels, the train can only take 3 hits from a rock before being destroyed, and even worse, there are no health pickups here. To make matters even worse on top of that, there are a bunch of different train tracks, and the train starts weaving between all of them. Naturally, you're kind of focused on clearing out the rocks on the projected path of the train. However, just doing that won't get you through the level, because the train actually takes damage from rocks on other train lines due to the way it swings out to the side while changing directions. It is so unbelievably frustrating. I was really struggling with this section until I realized the game was giving me horrible advice. When you start the level, it tells you to tap the rocks to remove them. This works at the beginning of the level, but as it becomes more difficult, you find that you're just unable to keep up. Instead, the better move is to hold the stylus down permanently and just swipe across the screen. It's way faster and way more efficient than just tapping the rocks. After this, the game goes back to the standard gameplay we started off with, Patrick not really having any notable differences compared to SpongeBob here. I think the biggest issue with this version of Creature from the Krusty Krab is that when the game isn't challenging, it's just kind of dull. But the only times it does get challenging is when it has really frustrating level design. Most of the time the challenge comes from fighting the awkward control scheme. This game becomes an absolute chore when precision is required, and anytime you're asked to change directions quickly or jump in quick succession made me want to tear my hair out. The other frustrating element is that so often the game will have you getting jumped by enemies that were off screen, and you really could have never anticipated them being there. Patrick's levels love having these bomb-throwing enemies that will just destroy you without you ever having a fair chance to avoid them. Next up, you move into Plankton's section, which kinda skips over the whole Krabby Patty chase segment, and instead moves to Kaiju Plankton. However, in this version, you constantly need to grab these power-ups to stay in your Kaiju form. Outside of that, it's basically the same as all the other levels, although this section is weirdly short. And overall, that's kind of the theme here. The core gameplay never changes in any major way from what you're doing with SpongeBob at the very beginning. They do end up giving you more and more one-off gameplay segments as you progress, like a plane flying level and a top-down giant plankton section, but the lure of those were not enough to keep me playing what is ultimately a very mediocre game. Maybe if the animated cutscenes were higher quality, they could have got me to stick around until the very end. This really is another classic case of the DS having a control scheme that was kinda difficult to develop for. So many devs got sucked into focusing entirely on the touchscreen gimmick, but they just weren't able to execute well enough to make it fun. Ultimately, there were a lot of games ruined on this console purely because the devs had no idea what they were doing compared to Nintendo's internal development teams. While overall this game feels a little less jarring than its home console sibling, it's still not a fun time. Creature from the Krusty Krab does just enough to squeak into D tier. Continuing their run of GBA SpongeBob games, WayForward are back again for Creature from the Krusty Krab, and apparently this was one hell of a game. At the time of release, it sat on a 72 average review score, which actually makes it the highest score for any version of this game. I was really starting to vibe with WayForward's 2D platformers, but because nothing related to Creature from the Krusty Krab can just be normal, they've strayed from the formula they had built up here, and opted to throw out a million different types of gameplay, just like the home console version. Things get off to a weird start immediately, with the game being framed as a movie for some reason. When you start up the game, it shows a movie theater, and when you die after losing all of your lives, the continue screen appears in a theater. This is basically never shown again, and is certainly never referenced within the game itself, outside of the theater being used as a transition to the credits once you beat the game. Then the gameplay actually begins, and unsurprisingly, there's a driving twist at the beginning. As we know very well by now, SpongeBob apparently loves dreaming about hot rod racing. This has easily got to be one of the most f***ed up driving levels I have ever played. For starters, everybody cheats and takes off early here, so it's lucky that this version, like the rest of the versions, isn't really a race. This whole section is still a side-scrolling platformer, and it's so chaotic. You're also supposed to do backflips and front flips to regain your health here. It's all such a bizarre way to kick things off, and it gets even worse in the second level, which feels like a fever dream where everything is just kind of a blurry mess. Maybe the third level will be something a little more chill. Nope. We've at least got some kind of normal platforming going on here, but the fact that this whole thing plays out like the Big Blue Smash Bros stage is going to keep you on your toes. The goal here is to jump from SpongeBob's hot rod up into the clouds to grab parts that will be used to repair it. Each time you grab a part, you need to then successfully jump back down to the car. It's actually quite tricky, and if you miss your landing on the car, you will lose a life. And then after that, you're completely done with the hot rod section of the game. Next thing you know, SpongeBob is asking where you're dropping, and he's gliding into the next season of Fortnite. As is tradition, this transitions us into Patrick's first section. The random gameplay wheel has landed on side-scrolling beat 'em up here, which makes sense, but unfortunately combat is so stiff that it really ruins the whole thing. Also, Patrick can just fly here, which really removes a lot of the actual gameplay. The game allows you to just keep flying onwards until you end up on a screen that requires you to clear a certain amount of enemies it sends at you before you can progress. Throughout this level, you'll be picking up a bunch of stuff like Z tokens that return again, but this time they purely get used to restore your health. Also, I picked up this moon looking power up, but I have no idea what it did. Once you fly your way through Patrick's level, you'll find yourself flying again, but this time in a vertical scrolling shmup style level. I tell you what, it's kind of impressive how committed this game is to not offering the same gameplay in back-to-back levels. I'm like half a dozen levels into this thing, and we still haven't repeated any type of gameplay. The controls in this level are not great, and feel very unresponsive. Half the time I had the feeling that the game wasn't even registering my inputs, and I'm going to chalk this down to being the casualty of having so many gameplay types here. You're probably not going to be able to fine tune and polish every single type of gameplay when you're shoving in like 15 different genres. Then all of a sudden we were already up to Plankton's first section of the game, which is easily the closest the game has come to just using the same gameplay style. It's very reminiscent of Patrick's first level, but skews things heavily in favour of platforming instead of combat. It's also the closest the game comes to feeling like WayForward's previous SpongeBob 2D platformers, and it just made me mad that these guys didn't pump out another one of those. I can appreciate changing things up, but Creature from the Krusty Krab on GBA is not it. This is then followed up by a similar level, but it incorporates the giant Krabby Patty chase into it, giving a much greater challenge and sense of urgency to everything you do here. Honestly, these levels went a long way to redeeming some of the garbage I had to wade through at the start of the game. These are easily the best 2 levels so far. And then we transition into SpongeBob's next section, which is also a platformer. Maybe this game was starting to turn things around. Quickly that feeling disappeared though, as I discovered that SpongeBob has no attack in this level, leaving him completely vulnerable to enemies. This was mostly bearable until I encountered these brown things. If they touch you, they stick to you, and then you just die without having any way to dispatch them. Well, actually, to counter these enemies, the game wants you to mash the D-pad in all directions. And when I say mash it, I really mean it. Just half-heartedly pressing the buttons isn't going to cut it here. You need to damn near burn a hole in your fingers like you're playing a Nintendo 64 Mario Party release if you want SpongeBob to survive. Because you have no attack here, you actually need to let these enemies attach themselves to you in some cases. Shaking them off will make them disappear, and you'll need them to disappear to actually complete a lot of the platforming. If they attach themselves to SpongeBob while he's attempting a jump, you're just cooked. After button mashing our way through the Alaskan bullworm, we jump into the plane for a flying section that actually feels pretty good for the most part. No real complaints here. We then get a genuine shmup section with Patrick strapped to his rocket, which just had me questioning once again why every damn licensed game in the 2000s was obsessed with putting in a section like this. Seriously, go back through every game I have reviewed on this channel, and I'd say close to 50% of them have some sort of gameplay segment that could be classified as part of this genre. I was completely flabbergasted when the next level started, and I was just playing a version of Asteroids. Then when the final level of Patrick's section started, and it was a homage to tube shooters, well, I couldn't help but be slightly impressed that they took this entire section of Creature from the Krusty Krab to pay tribute to old school arcade games. It's not exactly fun, but I appreciate the thought behind it. Next up, we've got Plankton going kaiju, and possibly the worst set of levels in the entire game. These are all about shooting lasers from Plankton's gigantic eye, and featured the worst controls in possibly the history of ever. You press B to shoot and use the D-pad to move, but there's a problem. You also need to aim, and the GBA doesn't really have any other good options for this. WayForward decided to make holding down B and then using the D-pad how you would aim your shots. This is awful. It feels so clunky, and while you can stumble through the first level here without much issue, each following level is worse than the last. The second level has Plankton standing on a bridge, needing to defend it from being blown up. Why is this gigantic destructive maniac all of a sudden trying to defend something from being blown up? No idea, don't ask questions here. Here you've got cars dropping bombs, tanks, jets firing missiles, and helicopters that you need to frantically aim at and destroy. Needless to say, the control scheme here doesn't make a perfect match for Twitch responses, and as a result you'll be awkwardly mashing down B, trying to aim up a shot, and then quickly letting go of B before tapping it again to shoot. It's a mess. The next level is very similar, however you only have to deal with the jets and helicopters, which actually makes things worse, as these are way harder to hit than the ground-based vehicles. I was struggling big time with this level, and only somehow managed to beat it when the game allowed me to progress with no health left. The last of Plankton's levels here has you climbing up a building while trying not to get bonked on the head. Compared to the last 3 levels, this was a masterpiece. While I really enjoyed Plankton's first set of levels, these levels where he's a giant are so bad that it completely negates any of the positives those initial levels brought to the table. We get a plane segment with SpongeBob next, where you're running from Plankton in what feels like another arcade game homage that I can't quite put my finger on. We have another indoors flying section, and then we randomly take the fight to some jellyfish while Plankton twirls around and fires at us.
Twirling, twirling, twirling towards freedom.
This level was another one that was complete trash, and by this point I'd just had enough. There was no redeeming Creature from the Krusty Krab with how bad the first 80% of the game had been. The only other notable thing to mention here is that scattered throughout levels are these arcade machine pickups. Grabbing these unlocks minigames back at the main menu under the arcade section, and these give you some real classics like SpongeBob jerking off dinner plates and Flappy Bob. Visually, I think the game looks solid. I don't really have anything major to say about it. However, playing this after the DS version was pretty jarring because the games look identical. Like if you showed a random person a clip from the DS game, obviously only showing them a single screen, and then a clip from the GBA game, they'd absolutely assume they were from the same exact game. Clearly this is how WayForward were able to develop both games at the same time, but it makes me retrospectively a little bit more mad about the DS game's visuals. This game is horrendous. I've played a bunch of WayForward games on this channel, and this is absolutely one of the worst I've seen from them. The mishmash of gameplay styles never comes close to working. The only time this game is genuinely fun is when it sticks close to the 2D platformer gameplay. Anytime they stray from this, it just becomes a chore to play. Instead of doing one thing really well, they decided to do everything really shit. Part of this was probably out of the devs' hands too, unfortunately. I'm sure having to stick closely to the home console version was a mandate for them, and that game set the tone with its overall bizarre vibes and constant changing of what the genre was from level to level. I'm genuinely shocked this game ended up with the highest review score of the 3 versions. What were reviewers smoking when they played this? This is genuine garbage. Creature from the Krusty Krab on GBA is our first certified F-tier game in the SpongeBob series. This was such a disappointment after the SpongeBob movie game and Lights Camera Pants on GBA were pretty fun 2D platformers. Instead of going back to that, which honestly could have been a pretty easy adaptation of the home console version, we get an awful hodgepodge of gameplay that rivals their god-awful regular show game. About a year after Creature from the Krusty Krab, Blitz Games are back for a follow-up, this time based on the TV special Atlantis SquarePantis. For those of you that don't know, Atlantis SquarePantis was a really big deal at the time. It was billed as SpongeBob's first TV movie or special. The series had done special double episodes before, but this was a double episode with a 40-minute runtime. Naturally, Nickelodeon were making a huge deal out of this, and like they did for the actual movie, they gave this TV movie a video game adaptation. Despite being squarely in my Nickelodeon phase when this episode dropped, I had somehow never seen it before, so I watched it for the sake of this review, and good lord is it bad. It's basically 40 minutes of the Bikini Bottom crew walking from room to room. It's like a crappy version of Willy Wonka. It's definitely not a good special, and it's also a musical where the songs suck. However, it was a massive hit, and it was instantly crowned as the highest viewed episode of the show at the time, so clearly this big marketing blitz worked. In fact, I believe this is the most watched episode premiere of all time for SpongeBob. It's the literal peak of the series' popularity. Part of the build to that massive hype was this game, which actually released a few weeks before the episode aired. When you jump into the game, you're greeted by a lot of the same things we saw in Creature from the Krusty Krab, a shop and minigames most notably. There's also something called SpongeBob SquarePants, which allowed me to customize SpongeBob into the most bizarre outfit I had ever seen. I naively assumed this was a costume editor for the main game. After all, the last game did have alternate costumes. Instead, this just changes the outfit that SpongeBob wears on the tutorial screen. Why even bother putting this in the game? If you were one of the lucky kids that picked this game up on release day, you wouldn't have known it, but the game actually starts like 90% of the way through the story of Atlantis SquarePantis, where Plankton is rampaging in his tank. The game then flashes back to the beginning and tells the rest of the story chronologically. No idea why Blitz decided to make this change. Maybe they were looking for a more action-packed way to start off the game. If you've seen Atlantis SquarePantis, you'll know that this is basically the only action scene in the special, so if they were coming at it from that point of view, it kinda makes sense. Atlantis SquarePantis is not even remotely something that needed to be turned into a game. You'll also have noticed that something is really off with these cutscenes. From what I can tell, they took the 2D environments from the show and then replaced the characters with the 3D models from the game. This is horrifyingly bad. Every cutscene here is just so off-putting, and after watching this for 5 seconds, it's immediately apparent that they should have stuck to one style. It honestly would have been kinda cool if they just used the footage from the special as the cutscenes. Would have been a great way for people to sorta own the special before it would ever see a home video release. I can imagine Nick wouldn't have allowed that though. Why Blitz Games didn't decide to just do completely 3D cutscenes is beyond me though. It's another in the seemingly never-ending list of weird choices they make. Like I said, the Atlantis SquarePantis special is mostly just characters walking from room to room in Atlantis, so I was very curious to see how they'd turn that into a game. I shouldn't have been curious though, because the answer was obvious. This is another mishmash of gameplay styles. You've got the Plankton tank level first up, which also introduces the time element to players. Every single level features a timer that's counting up, and quite often specific actions will reduce the time on it. This only affects how many medallions you're given at the end of a level, which are then spent in the game's shop. It's an interesting way to do an in-game currency, as this usually comes down to collecting throwaway items. What's not interesting is the gameplay in this level. Plankton just drives a tank and mindlessly shoots enemies or switches to open doors. That's it, there's nothing else to say. Level 2 sends us back to the very start of the special, where SpongeBob and Patrick enter a cave and discover the Amulet of Atlantis. This results in a series of puzzles essentially played out in a top-down perspective. You switch back and forth between SpongeBob and Patrick, having to use their special abilities to overcome various obstacles and eventually reach the exit. SpongeBob can lever up gates, change the direction of cannons, and move objects out of the way with his spatula, while Patrick can throw SpongeBob across gaps. Longtime fans of the channel will recognize this as Lost Vikings style gameplay, something that I loathe. Hell must have frozen over though, because this is actually really fun. Part of it might be that you don't have to navigate the entire level twice and get both characters to the exit. Just reaching the exit with one character here is sufficient, and it makes these levels way less tedious than they would be otherwise. During your journey, you'll come across ghost pirates that you'll need to avoid, as well as just generally avoiding falling to your death. Dying here doesn't have any major penalties though, you just kind of respawn right where you were, so it just makes everything so much easier, and I'm not even sure why they bothered with this, to be perfectly honest. The cherry on top for this section of the game is that the banter between SpongeBob and Patrick is really fun here. Overall, I was pleasantly surprised by this level. Level 3 continues the cavalcade of random gameplay, this time reviving Pokemon Snap. Here you move through the museum on rails, murdering guests with Krabby Patties and taking flash photography of all the exhibits. The goal here is to take photos of the exhibits, and I was initially worried when the game seemingly wouldn't register some of these as having been photographed. But hey, it turns out you don't actually need to take photos of them all. In fact, I'm not sure that you need to take any photos at all to progress here. Whatever, let's move on to level 4 that tries to tie in an interesting element of the actual TV special. Atlantis SquarePantis is a musical, and one of the story elements is that the bus that takes the Bikini Bottom crew to Atlantis is powered by song. Here we get a rhythm game to power the bus, which is very basic. I could not imagine anybody of any age failing this. Each character takes turns being the lead in the rhythm game, and SpongeBob's section makes no sense. While the other characters are playing instruments, SpongeBob gets up like he's about to sing, only for there to be no singing. The same thing happens with Patrick, and one of his canned lines during this is literally, "I'm singing." No you ain't, buddy.
I'm singing!
4 levels in, and we've had 4 different types of gameplay. We've also only had one level that isn't awful, so not promising signs. Level 5 continues the trend, giving us a driving section where you need to collect toolkits to repair the bus. This is so laughably basic. The game tells you exactly where you need to go at all times, and outside of having to occasionally drive over some buttons to activate ramps and stuff like that, you really don't need to think here. The driving does control well, and something is really pleasing about the way the bus wiggles when you turn, but outside of that, there's not much depth here. Mostly, I'm just baffled that they went through the effort of programming a nice feeling driving section for a single level. This gameplay literally never returns. Seems like so much unnecessary work from a developer on a time crunch. The way Blitz games spend their dev time is so baffling to me. We can't get fully 3D cutscenes, but they'll spend their time and effort making something truly unique for, what, a 5-minute segment of the game? Level 6 sees the crew finally reach Atlantis, and here we're greeted by David Bowie in a G-string. Well, actually, David Bowie's character is only voiced by Nolan North here. What a shame, we just have to substitute music royalty for voice acting royalty. Here you follow not David Bowie and basically just do the rhythm game again. I'd argue this is basically the first time we've repeated gameplay, because while it's slightly tweaked and you're not actually pressing the buttons in time with any rhythm, it's fundamentally the same. At the end of each section in this level, you get a quick time event where you need to wiggle the analog sticks, one of which involves SpongeBob beating up a plant. This exact structure is repeated for every character in the crew, before mercifully the level ends. It's clear at this point, where we're almost halfway through the game's 14 levels, that Blitz are grasping at straws to find gameplay inspiration in the source material. At least we get to see SpongeBob hit the gritty again at the end of this level.
I'll rate it 5 out of 10.
Level 7 focuses on the rare pairing of Sandy and Mr. Krabs, where gems are falling from the ceiling and you need to zap them to collect them. Each color of gem has a score tied to them, and if you zap 3 of the same color in a row, you get even more points. Essentially, it's a match 3 puzzle game, but without the puzzles. Just another boring time waster. The next level focuses on Squidward posing for the artists of Atlantis, requiring you to hit button combos as quickly as you can to pull off different poses. At this point, it was clear that Blitz's solution to the source material not being ripe for a game is just to shove in as many QuickTime event-based levels as possible. At this point, we're just playing QTE the game. Or in this level's case, it's like activating Grand Theft Auto cheat codes the game. Next level is another Pokemon Snap level, which really emphasized that the game does not give a damn if you miss photos. If the only punishment is that my score is going to be lower at the end of the level and I get less currency to spend at the in-game shop, that's fine by me. Thankfully, level 10 brings back the puzzle solving gameplay from earlier, but this time with even more depth. Sandy, Squidward, and Mr. Krabs join in, and they all get their own unique abilities. Sandy has a lasso that can bring people to her across gaps and can activate switches, which is weirdly unresponsive to do with the analog stick. Squidward can sprint on treadmills, which feels completely random. Like, really? That's the special ability you came up with for him? Clearly Squidward's most notable trait is running, and it's just a coincidence that when I Google Squidward treadmill, I can't find a single screenshot of this ever happening. Lastly, Mr. Krabs sucks up treasure that is blocking your path, and can even float over gaps if there is treasure nearby, all via the power of greed. Unsurprisingly, these are still the most fun levels in the game, and only get better with the addition of more characters. The only thing I disliked is that they never went all in and used all of the characters' powers together at once. They stick to just having characters in pairs, which is nice, but I would have loved a final level where all 5 came together. You really wouldn't have been able to build a full game around these levels without it getting stale, but god did I prefer these to the dull QTE slop that most other levels have been. Speaking of QTE slop, that's exactly what level 11 is. Level 12 sees Sandy using Squidward as a gun, where she has to jerk him off to shoot enemies. Literally just out here milking Squidward dry. This is an on-rails shooter that functions the same as the Pokemon Snap levels, but with combat being the entire focus now. I quickly discovered that while the game gives you ammo and you have to reload, the game actually doesn't make you wait for a reload animation to play out before you can start firing again. This means you can press the fire and reload buttons at the exact same time to unlock infinite ammo. These are the kind of moments that make me feel like Blitz Games just doesn't care, and they're kind of just cashing paychecks here. Even with the infinite ammo, this level is way too long, super tedious, and I was thrilled when it was over. Level 13 is basically a repeat of level 1, as the story has finally caught up again. As you were doing at the start, you just go around dully shooting other tanks, turrets, and switches. This is also the actual final level, because level 14 is another rhythm game, but it just plays out over the credits, which you don't even have to actually engage in, because you literally can't lose this. And yeah, that's all of Atlantis SquarePantis. You'll be able to knock out this game in around 3 hours that feel like 30 because it's such a brutal time. It's such a weird game to talk about from a gameplay perspective because the gameplay itself isn't super egregiously bad here. I didn't find myself infuriated and raging over it. It's more that the gameplay is so dull and there's literally no difficulty here. It feels like a Nick Jr. game or something. After sitting and thinking about the game for a bit, I did have the thought that the design of the game may have been massively influenced by the Wii. I played the PS2 version and the only other console this game was on was the Wii, which is kinda weird. No idea why they skipped the PS3 and Xbox 360. I get the feeling Blitz developed this as a Wii game first and foremost, basically aiming to make this a collection of motion controlled minigames. Minigame collections that were just a bunch of cute motion control gimmicks were all the rage at this time on the Wii. At some point, an executive probably saw the install base of the PS2 and said, hey, why don't we just chuck this onto that console, sell a gajillion copies, and not care if the gameplay really doesn't work? According to a list MPD put out in 2020, this game actually beat Creature from the Krusty Krab in sales and sat as the 5th highest selling game in franchise history. So that executive probably got a big fat bonus. I don't know, it's just a theory. Except for the bonus part, that probably happened regardless. Once you're done with the game, you can go to the shop and spend your hard-earned money on concept art, arcade games, more outfits for the tutorial screen, and a director's commentary. This immediately grabbed my attention because genuine director's commentary for games have really only recently become a thing. And yeah, I just knew it was too good to be true here. It's actually commentary where SpongeBob pretends that the whole game/special was something that they'd filmed. Personally, I would have preferred an actual director from Blitz talking here. Maybe then we'd get some answers for the insane decisions made. I guess this would be an okay way to do a replay of the game, as the fourth wall breaks here are pretty cute, but I don't think there's nearly enough commentary to cover up the boring gameplay. The bigger issue is that after I played through the entire campaign, I was only able to unlock commentary for 2 levels. There are cheat codes that will allow you to unlock, amongst other things, all commentary tracks, but if you were to earn these legitimately, you would be grinding forever. Just another insane decision. And again, I've got to roast this game for its visuals. Atlantis SquarePantis is so underwhelming. I don't think there are any noticeable improvements compared to Creature from the Krusty Krab, which was already a game that looked far worse than the games that had preceded it. It's honestly pretty inexcusable that the game is this ugly and PS1 feeling when we had the PS3 for like a year now. I'm not expecting God of War here, but some sort of visual polish would be nice. We know it's possible because Battle for Bikini Bottom and the movie game exist. Much like Creature from the Krusty Krab, amongst the sponge billion different gameplay ideas on display, there is a single nugget of gold. In the previous game, it was the SpongeBob 3D platformer levels, while here it's the top-down puzzle solving. Everything outside of that is completely worthless. The most frustrating thing is that it feels like there isn't really any passion put into these games from Blitz. Maybe I'm unfairly comparing them to Heavy Iron, who set such a high standard, but it's hard not to. Why should we settle for anything less? And some of the blame for this monstrosity needs to be placed on whoever had the idea to make a home console game for this special. Whether it was Nick's, THQ's, or Blitz's idea, Atlantis SquarePantis is one of the least fitting pieces of inspiration for a video game ever. I kinda wanted to shove this down into F tier, because like 85% of this game is monotonous QuickTime events or on-rails photography, but the 2 puzzle solving levels are so good that they manage to elevate the entire game. I've reluctantly got to place Atlantis SquarePantis on PS2 and Wii into D tier. WayForward's run as the go-to handheld developer for the SpongeBob series of games is over, and we've now seen Altron take over. They're no stranger to this channel. I've covered roughly 10 of their games previously. They're a dev that is maybe, no idea if they're still around because their last game is reported as being released in 2019. Their website's still alive, so maybe they're alive. Anyway, they're based in Japan, and they were pretty much the kings of licensed handheld games. Despite pumping out so many games on a ridiculous timeline, some of them have actually been pretty good. And while this was their first SpongeBob game, they had worked on Nick shows before. Freeze Frame Frenzy might be their most notable title, alongside Hey Arnold, Fairly Odd Parents, Rocket Power, All Grown Up, Tack, and 2 Danny Phantom games. They also come back for Drawn to Life and Truth or Square. Based on Metacritic user scores, it seems like this is the most beloved version of Atlantis SquarePantis, so I'm interested to see what Altron cooked up here. Signs are very promising from the start. The game immediately boots up with SpongeBob in a shrunken version of Bikini Bottom, where you can walk from SpongeBob's house to the Krusty Krab in like 4 seconds. I'll excuse this though, because firstly, this is entirely in 3D, and secondly, all of this is actually just a menu. Altron did something really over the top here, with the game's menus being a 3D environment. These pop up a few different times throughout the campaign, and they really only serve to allow you to save the game, even though the game prompts you to save after every level, and check out some of the bonus content or the multi-card play. This addition is entirely unnecessary, but the effort and care here is super promising. I also think that the environments and character models looked pretty damn good for the DS, not just here, in general in the game. The environments are nice and varied, and at times it felt like they had more life to them than the pretty bland and sterile environments in the home console version. The narrative here is about what you would expect, with the story coming via a combination of text boxes, animated cutscenes, and still frames. They do take some liberties with the rich and complex narrative of Atlantis SquarePantis though. Most notably, they add a whole detour to a place called Moo. This section is one of the lengthiest in the game, which should again emphasize that it made no sense to turn this special into a game. As for the gameplay, this feels more like a worthy home console game than the actual home console game. The majority of levels play out like a 3D side-scrolling platformer. Every level sees a mixture of platforming, combat, and puzzle solving, with the exact makeup depending on what's going on in the story at the time. Altron really shines a light on all 3 phases here, which is why the characters have a deep roster of abilities. To get you used to these, the game offers a tutorial area from the main menu, where you can practice specific actions that will pop up frequently in the main campaign. It's a welcome idea, but also a bit redundant because the actual campaign also walks you through these abilities. Usually dedicated tutorial sections that are separate from the game itself mean that they're not going to hold your hand in the actual main campaign, but they did both here for some reason. To make things even deeper, the platforming levels are always played with you controlling 2 characters from the Bikini Bottom crew. It almost feels like it was built for a co-op mode, which is kind of hard to do on the DS. Just another thing about this game that makes it feel like it should have been on a home console instead of what Blitz dumped out. You start out with just SpongeBob and Patrick. Patrick can throw SpongeBob upwards to reach higher platforms, while SpongeBob can throw Patrick like a shuriken or toss him across gaps. SpongeBob also has the ability to inflate himself, which he can use to float over larger gaps, or when combined with Patrick, he can bring him up to higher platforms, something he struggles to do as, unlike SpongeBob, he doesn't get a double jump. Just like the traversal, combat is weirdly deep here. Every character has a standard melee attack, which can also be mashed to pull off a combo. SpongeBob also gets a ranged attack where he blows bubbles. He can tap this to fire more rapidly, or charge it up to make larger, more powerful bubbles, like you're playing Bomberman, and in the process you make SpongeBob headbang. Instead of a ranged attack, Patrick has this charged butt bounce. Running around levels, you'll find plenty of shells to collect, which, to my surprise, act like ammo. You need shells to activate a lot of the team-up abilities between the characters, so if I wanted to throw Patrick to kill an enemy, I would need a certain number of shells. This felt like a random tacked-on system. For 99% of the game, I didn't even think about whether I had ammo or not. It was only until a particularly cumbersome combat-heavy level towards the end of the game where I started spam throwing Patrick to speed things up. Here I eventually ran into ammo troubles for the very first time. Combat, despite having access to a lot of attacks, is pretty brainless. Just mash the buttons without much thought. Platforming on the other hand controls really well, and I enjoyed a lot of the ways they laid out levels to specifically highlight the use of each character's different traversal options. It also felt like, whether intentional or not, there were multiple solutions to some of the platforming obstacles, which was neat. Surprisingly, this game is very light on touchscreen integration. A big change after the last DS game was entirely dependent on it. You can control the camera's left to right movement with a swipe, and there's some basic activation of levers or simple puzzle solving, but it never gets too crazy in these main levels. You also switch characters via the touchscreen, which was kind of annoying. For game flow, it would have been nice to have a face button used for this, and there was also an annoying glitch at one point where the game wouldn't switch my character, despite all of the other touchscreen options working. Where the touchscreen does play a bigger role is in these interstitial levels that break up the platforming. This is where the minigame compilation nature of the home console game sort of has an influence here. You'll first get hit by this on-rails jellyfish shooting section that plays out so slowly that it's immediately just lame as hell. You spin around and tap on jellyfish for way too long. You'll also get other levels like this where you're absolutely rocketing bags of money at Mr. Krabs, taking photos of SpongeBob, or playing Clarinet Hero. These breaks from the main game are almost always very lame, and they aren't always guaranteed to use the touchscreen. I feel like they had a good thing going with the platforming gameplay for the most part, so to me these sections breaking it up were entirely unnecessary. While I did enjoy the platforming levels a lot for the most part, there were some pretty glaring flaws. One of the biggest is that the game loves to pick and choose when your AI partner will follow you. Most of the time they'll be running right behind you, but as soon as you do anything slightly out of the norm, like say pulling off a particularly tricky jump, the AI will just give up, stop in their tracks, and refuse to follow you anymore. This requires you to stop what you're doing with your main character, switch to the character that has refused to budge like they're a toddler throwing a public tantrum, and make them catch up. Or alternatively, you can reach the level's exit and then do it all again with the other character, forcing yourself to stray ever so closely to the dreaded Lost Vikings gameplay. Initially, I thought this might have been a bit of an oversight from Altron, but the more I played, the more elements I found that reeked of padding, so this might have been a way to stretch out the game's length. It'll take you around 3 hours to beat, and that includes a completely made up detour in Moo, and a bunch of tedious things added to your experience. Again, Atlantis SquarePantis did not need to be a video game. Amongst all this padding is a level where you're forced to backtrack to grab an item after reaching the end of the level, several levels also that require you to run back to the beginning of the level under the guise of some sort of time chase segment, and then there's the most annoying one of all, the dreaded backtracking to change characters. So once you reach Moo, the game gives you the chance to play as Sandy and Mr. Krabs, each complete with their own unique traversal abilities. This is cool, and it gives levels from this point onwards so much more depth due to the ways they can combine abilities amongst all the characters. But unfortunately, Altron didn't think to give you a good way to switch characters. There are these infrequently appearing huts that are used to switch your character loadout. Instead of having these appear right where you would need a specific character's ability, you're almost always required to backtrack. When you start a level, the game never gives you any indication of which character's abilities will be needed. It's pretty damn annoying because levels almost always only require 2 specific characters. It's not like you're ever switching between all 4. If this is the case, why even offer the ability to switch? Just force me to be the correct characters and then I'll figure out how their abilities will combine to get me through the level. It's so damn annoying to come up to an object that can only be destroyed by Sandy, or a patch of seaweed that can only be cut down by crabs, resulting in you having to backtrack to make a change. You can never predict what character is required, so it just feels unfair. Then there are levels, or sections of levels, that are just tedious at their core, And really poorly designed. Patrick has the ability to move around large objects, and this is usually used for him to place something on a pressure plate to activate a switch that will then open a door. Anytime you need to do this for more than a few seconds makes the game a complete slog. The worst is when you need to drag around this flame while also running back and forth to lower and raise platforms. It really is an exercise in patience. Then there's this section where if you don't activate the switch to make a conveyor belt travel in the correct direction, the object you're pushing will fall into the void and you actually soft lock yourself. Pretty neat. However, the most tedious section doesn't involve Patrick at all. Instead, it's this cyberspace section that plays out like the Saffron City gym puzzle, where you're warping from area to area. The goal is to find these 5 balls of light that somehow give you a passcode that you need to enter that unlocks a door. There's no real strategy to finding your way through this. You sort of brute force it and stumble along, and again, it's an exercise in patience. At one point, I found my way to the exit with only 2 or 3 of the 5 items collected. Because I'm a cheating bastard, I tried to use a long play to just input the code anyway, and it seems like the game might actually randomize what the correct code is here. My code was different to the one I saw in the video I was watching, so there's at least some sort of variation, which would be a neat idea if I wasn't so tilted by the back and forth warping. The thing that really pushed me over the edge was this combat section in Atlantis, which I alluded to earlier. SpongeBob and Patrick pop the oldest bubble, and now you need to escape. This section starts off with Sandy offering to clear the way, and the game dumps you in this insane section where you have to defeat 30 straight enemies. These enemies are also complete sponges as well. No enemy prior to this required more than a couple of hits to take down, but these dudes just will not die. After what felt like an eternity, I got through all 30 enemies, only to be treated to a section where SpongeBob and Patrick are stopped every 5 seconds and need to clear a room full of enemies. All of these rooms are completely identical too, which feels weirdly cheap in a game where there had been such varied environments. They even straight up reuse boss battles here, which is so annoying. As I already touched on, the combat is insanely shallow here, so dedicating such a lengthy chunk of the game to it all in a row is pretty brutal. The game never has such a strong emphasis on combat like this throughout the rest of the game, so it's a bit jarring and it really kills the mood. Another good example is the boss battles I briefly mentioned. These are infrequent, but when they pop up, they're just a waste of time. Like this one against Sandy requires little more than mashing the attack button, or the boss battle against a pile of gears that requires little more than pressing jump and then mashing the attack button. There's really no depth to fighting enemies here. Although that last boss battle did seemingly glitch out on me and actually restarted mid-fight, giving the boss full health again. No, it wasn't like there was a second stage or different form or something, it just literally restarted. One of the most bizarre things I've ever witnessed. You may have noticed there's a distinct lack of Squidward here, except for his starring role in Clarinet Hero. Well, that's because for some insane reason he isn't playable until you beat the game. Because of this, it actually means he's irrelevant. None of his abilities are required to get through the campaign, because otherwise he would have been unlocked at the same time as Krabs and Sandy. Just a bizarre choice. And before I rank this game, I need to touch on the difficulty. It's basically non-existent here, at least on normal difficulty. Combat is really just a suggestion in this game, as 90% of the time you can literally run past them without any consequences, and you have so much health that if an enemy does happen to hit you, it really doesn't matter. There are some platforming sections that should have been difficult, but they're made irrelevant because this game will often respawn you ahead of where you just died. It's a crazy oversight. Any attempt to make the game difficult usually just makes the game more tedious, like the fact that every single enemy respawns. It doesn't make life harder for you, it mostly just means you have to do more mindless mashing of the attack button. I think Atlantis SquarePantis on the DS is a case of missed potential. Altron were onto something with this platforming gameplay, but there are so many oversights and strange design quirks that make it all such an uneven experience. The game being stuffed full of padding also hurts. I know they were probably doing their best to make a tough situation better, but I think I would have rather this game be like 2 hours long instead of just making me backtrack constantly. Ranking this game is such a tough task. If I'm being brutally honest, the more I played, the less I enjoyed. The game's quality takes a major nosedive once you reach Atlantis. It's where you really start to feel like Altron were desperate to make this game hit the 3-hour mark. By the end of it, I really wanted to give this D tier. But at the same time, I enjoyed this way more than any other D tier game, and it's just so far ahead of the previous 2 home console games. After sitting on it for a little bit and letting the frustration of fighting 30 enemies in a row as Sandy drain away, I'm going to place this one in C tier. This is the final ever SpongeBob game on the GBA, so let's see if Altron goes out with a bang here. Immediate first impressions are that Altron have definitely tried to replicate as much of their DS game here for Atlantis SquarePantis on the GBA. This is a distinctly different game, but it does look like they were trying to cut costs and shave down dev time wherever they could. For example, this game also uses the interactive menu from the first game, keeping the same core idea, but making it 2D. Heck, they even have the optional tutorial here, despite the main game again teaching you everything you need to know. And just like the DS game, this is entirely built around a co-op experience, bouncing between combinations of 2 characters to use their special team-up abilities. While you can see a lot of the DS version's DNA here, there was one truly unique element introduced right away: your bubble power gauge. This game's bizarre name for the health bar can be upgraded by grabbing experience points, also known as shells. Once you fill up your experience meter, the game will grant you essentially another whole life to your health bar, and it's a nice incentive to actually get you to try and collect these shells instead of just being a meaningless collectible. Combat is relatively simple here. B button is your attack, with SpongeBob having a ranged attack to shoot bubbles, which can also be held down to create larger, more powerful bubbles. On the other hand, Patrick has a lick attack. What the hell? You can also defeat enemies by jumping on them, and I found this to be the most efficient way to defeat enemies, even the more powerful ones. You jump on their heads so rapidly, especially when you're in a space with a low ceiling, that defeating any enemy just becomes a breeze. You've also got some all-time great enemies to fight here, like Jellyfish and Guy in Turtleneck. The best part is that these enemies keep showing up for the entire game, even once you start exploring Atlantis. The real hook of the gameplay, like the DS version, is the team-up moves between character pairings. These are always used to add a more powerful traversal ability, or the ability to smash down a roadblock that's halting progression. Naturally, the first character pairing is SpongeBob and Patrick, who use a butt bounce to smash through certain floors. Just like on the DS, character changing huts return, allowing you to pick the character that is right for the job, and in a stroke of genius, these huts are placed much more conveniently here. It was a real relief to know that when I came to a roadblock, I'd probably only be backtracking 5 to 10 seconds to select the right characters for this obstacle. One of the things that did catch me off guard about this version is that all of the characters are pretty much identical. The only real difference between them is whether they have a ranged or melee attack, which now that I think of it, SpongeBob is the only character with a ranged attack, so really the only unique characters in this game are SpongeBob and everybody that's not SpongeBob. It truly is all about the team-up abilities. Once again, Mr. Krabs can chop down seaweed, this time being activated when he's paired with Patrick, who becomes insanely buff while doing this for some reason. He's a big guy now. SpongeBob, big guy, pants okay. I guess they're implying that he needs to go Super Saiyan to pick up Krabs' heavy ass. SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs randomly get the high jump team up move here. Sandy can use SpongeBob's face to smash through walls. Sandy gets to throw Patrick like a ninja star, which actually makes more sense than the DS version using SpongeBob for this. And Sandy can use Krabs as a helicopter to get across gaps. Some of these pairings are super random, not really paying any attention or care to whether the ability matches the combo of characters. but the change to make Sandy throw Patrick like a ninja star kind of offsets that. Makes a lot more sense to me to have Sandy throwing Patrick around rather than weak-ass SpongeBob. Unfortunately, you might have noticed another glaring omission. Because this game is closely following the DS version, you again don't get to play as Squidward. Even worse, he doesn't become unlockable after completing the campaign, so he's just completely absent in the main gameplay. Most of the gameplay loop here is dedicated to finding that right pairing needed to progress through the level, but while doing this, there's also a solid amount of platforming. Sucks to say, but this feels super stiff. There's also no run option here, so you're stuck at this kind of awkward walking speed. I also noticed a weird delay between you being able to follow up a jump with another jump, like the game doesn't want you to move around that quickly. It's the only action I noticed this with, so I don't think it was something like input lag from a controller or something like that. It feels like something they deliberately implemented. I'm mostly just shocked that the platforming is so underwhelming because I know Altron is capable of way better. Thankfully, you never really do any truly crazy platforming segments, but I think it's quite telling that going around doing just kind of basic movement 99% of the time still feels cumbersome with how stiff the controls are here. One unique thing that they introduced during the Atlantis section of the game is what they call special sections. These are unique segments that can only be entered with a specific character pairing, and it tends to see the gameplay radically shifted. There was a bubble floating section with SpongeBob and Patrick where I needed to dodge hazards, a jetpack section with Krabs and Sandy that the game weirdly refers to as a drilling section, a random detour with Krabs and Patrick that is just a brick breaker game, an actual drilling section with SpongeBob and Krabs where all you really do is mash A, and a karate chopping section with SpongeBob and Sandy where you need to press the correct button depending on which character the game wants you to attack with. Essentially, the entire escape from Atlantis section after SpongeBob and Patrick pop the oldest bubble is dedicated to these sections, and it's pretty weird. Maybe if one of these sections appeared every now and then, it would be a nice change up, but having them all appear basically one after another was rough. The game was fine until it regressed to doing this. And hey, maybe I could have stomached all of these bunched up in one section of the game if they didn't also have these interstitial minigame sections butting in as well. Clarinet Hero returns, with the song you play here being identical to the one in the DS game. There's also a minigame with Krabs where you're catching coins. To get a higher score, you can change the value of the coins by trapping them in bubbles before catching them. The point of all this? I'm really not too sure. As far as I was aware, there was no way to fail this section, so I'm not really sure what the point of the points was. We've also got a minigame where you balance the world's oldest bubble, and one section that the game presents as a minigame, but is really just the game's combat using Sandy specifically. Altron tries to spice things up further with boss battles, but the solution to beating these are all so simple. It's literally just a rinse and repeat of dodge one or maybe two very basic attack patterns, and then you hit the boss. This goes for every fight, right up until the final battle with Plankton, which tries to change things slightly. Here you need to make Plankton walk onto a thumbtack, before essentially dropping a piano on his head. Not entirely sure why Plankton goes supersized here though and becomes a big guy. That ain't canon.
SpongeBob, big guy, pants okay.
Atlantis SquarePantis on the GBA isn't egregiously bad, but the core gameplay is pretty boring, and the stiff movement doesn't help. Despite this, the core gameplay is more fun than any of the minigame or special section stuff that they toss in. The closest the game comes to being genuinely good is in the very first level, before you've even unlocked all of the characters. Altron goes for a mini Metroidvania here, where you're exploring the level, grabbing items, and then using those items to unlock new characters, who then have abilities allowing you to progress deeper into the level. It's pretty bland if you're not a child, but as somebody's first experience with this type of genre, it would be pretty neat. Execution is a little sloppy here though, especially when they're trying to give the player instructions through the story. At one point you end up at the museum and you meet Squidward. You play Clarinet Hero, and after finishing that you're pushed out into another platforming segment where you're back out in Bikini Bottom. You then come across Krabs, who says he wants a gold spatula from the museum. Naturally, you'd be thinking that you need to backtrack based on everything that's happened in the story, right? I mean, I literally just came from the museum. But nope, you actually need to keep going forwards. Apparently SpongeBob and Patrick have just been teleporting around. Despite those kinds of hiccups, this was a lot more interesting than the later gameplay and kinda made me wish each level would have been designed like this. Another major negative for this version is that it just kinda lacks the right vibe for a SpongeBob game. One thing that was super noticeable was that the other characters are so mean to SpongeBob and Patrick before you unlock them. They're like over the top mean, especially Sandy. And then there's small attention to detail things like the turtleneck guy following you to Atlantis, or the fact that the Atlantean guards keep being an enemy for the crew after it became clear that everybody needs to stop plankton now. There are moments where Atlantis SquarePantis on GBA shines, and maybe if the game had completely done away with the minigames and special sections, or even just spaced them out better, this could have been a C tier game. However, the package we got is absolutely D tier. Lord help me, because I am about to Underpants slam this game. Underpants Slam is arguably one of the most unique games in the SpongeBob franchise. Released on December 26, 2007 to try and cash in on cashed up kids after all of their post-Christmas gifts, it was the first time a SpongeBob game had been released on the Xbox 360. Not only was this the first time it hit Microsoft's most successful console, it was also an exclusive. Why the exclusivity? Well, that's because this was a smaller game released as a digital-only title under the Xbox Live Arcade banner. If you're young and didn't grow up in this era, you might think digital games are the norm, but it was a real novelty in this era and absolutely cutting edge back in 2007. Ben 10 Alien Force: The Rise of Hex did something similar, being exclusive to Xbox Live Arcade and WiiWare. Leading this push towards the cutting edge frontier of gaming in 2007 was our good old friends Blitz Games. More specifically, this was developed by Blitz Arcade, an internal team at Blitz that was founded in 2006 specifically to make smaller downloadable titles. And because this was a digital-only title, this game actually became lost media for a period of time. With THQ crashing and burning, Underpants Slam would be delisted in January 2013. However, with THQ Nordic rising from the ashes 5 years later and acquiring the rights to a bunch of Nickelodeon properties, it was relisted on September 24, 2018 and made available on the latest Xbox consoles via backwards compatibility on November 15, 2021. To this day, you can still purchase Underpants Slam for $10 US. Unfortunately, like most of THQ Nordic's big promises and teasers since acquiring the rights to Nickelodeon IP, this game and Truth or Square are the only old SpongeBob games that ended up being relisted. While the development and behind the scenes history of Underpants Slam is quite interesting, the game itself is not. Having a name like Underpants Slam, you'd be forgiven for thinking this would be a fighter. Hell, maybe this is even a small Smash Bros clone or something. Nope. Instead, you just run around levels trying to collect 99 pairs of underpants while doing some light platforming before a timer runs out. That's it. That's the game. They don't ever even try to change things up. Every level in the game is just you collecting underpants in these pretty basic platforming stages. Most of the underpants will just be sitting out in the open for you to grab, but a portion of them in each level will either be held by jellyfish or hidden in items that need to be destroyed in the game's background. Both of these things have their own issues. Firstly, it's not always obvious which background objects need to be smashed to get underpants. I had cases where identical objects were both smashable and not smashable across stages, which makes things quite annoying. And the bigger issue is that getting underpants from jellyfish, or from the background objects as well, are both done via the game's combat, which is so clunky. You have a melee attack and a ground pound attack, and utilizing either of these is a pain. It's at its worst when trying to defeat the jellyfish. Something that should be so basic and simple becomes a whole pain in the underpants as you try to line up these very awkward attacks. The biggest issues with the controls though are found in the platforming itself. The game is entirely built on platforming, but that core element is so poor. Movement is awkward, and you quickly run into a frustrating issue with the ground pound. If you press A when you're in the air, even if you're just falling from a platform or doing something that doesn't involve jumping, the game will make you do a ground pound. In the overwhelming majority of games throughout history with a ground pound, it generally only gets activated after you've jumped. It just feels so awkward, and I was having to try and rewire my brain and forget the fundamentals of platforming while playing this dumpster fire. On top of trying to grab all 99 underpants before the timer runs out, you also have health. Taking damage from the jellyfish or falling through the bottom of the level will decrease your health, and once you run out, it's game over for that level. As you slog your way through levels, you'll find that a super meter is filling that allows you to do a super move. When you first pull this off, you'll probably assume that this is a screen clearing attack, but you'd be wrong. Instead, this only hits enemies in very specific spots. Lining this up is just impossible. It's pure luck if this attack will hit a jellyfish or not, which basically renders this whole mechanic as pointless because it doesn't really help you at all, not even that much more than your regular melee attack. If you're running out of time in the level, you can pick up these Atlantis medallions to add some more time to the clock. That way you can go back to flopping around levels in the search for underpants. And trust me, you'll be flopping around levels a lot. Once you get down to the remaining 10 to 15 underpants, each level becomes a slog of just slowly combing every inch of a level to find the last objects you need to break in order to hit 99 and get the hell out of there. It's just the absolute antithesis of fun. I think Blitz thought they were spicing things up with these random item boxes that are found scattered throughout levels, but these just made me hate the game more. It does one of my least favorite things in gaming, where the power-up could help you, or it could hurt you. Longtime fans of the channel will know I despise this design in games. It's so idiotic to have an element like this in the game, because it just inevitably teaches the player to steer clear of the item boxes. I could get a helpful power-up, like this magnet power-up that sucks in underpants, or I could get the speed debuff that makes you move at the speed of crawl, or even the one where they make your controls backwards. The positive power-ups never feel so helpful that the risk-reward scenario of grabbing one of these boxes is worth it. Once I tested these out a few times, I just played the rest of the game treating the boxes like they were enemies and needed to be avoided. There are a few gameplay options found in Underpants Slam, although they're all pretty much the same at their core. First up is Quest Mode, which is just you playing through the 9 stages in this game, trying to collect the pants before the time runs out. Then there's Time Trial, which is exactly the same, but the purpose is to do it as quick as possible, and they also disable the medallions that add time back on. To go through these modes, you can choose SpongeBob, Patrick, Krabs, and Sandy, with Plankton being an unlockable character. All of these characters are identical in function, so character choice purely comes down to who your favorite character from the show is. Level-wise, we've got 3 distinct level themes: Krusty Krab, Flying Dutchman's Ship, and Atlantis. You then get 3 unique stages underneath these themes, bringing the game's level total to 9. Levels try to change things up by adding moving walkways or trapdoors, but ultimately every single level in this game feels damn near identical. It's particularly bad for the levels that have the same theming. You can hardly tell any of the Krusty Krab levels apart from one another. With there only being 9 levels total, you'll be done with this game in like an hour. There is a stunning lack of content here. Even for a small digital title in 2007, I'd really be expecting a lot more than this. To be fair, it did feature online play, which I believe is a first for SpongeBob, and quite possibly Nickelodeon as a whole back in 2007. I could see a competitive version of this gameplay being slightly more fun than just racing against a timer by yourself, and maybe that was the biggest draw here. Unfortunately, online play is no longer possible, so I couldn't test it out. The final thing I wanted to touch on was that if you look this game up, a lot of sites will say that the soundtrack was reused from Creature from the Krusty Krab. While the main menu does give this impression because it recycles that main menu theme, I'm not sure that the individual level themes are recycled. At the very least, I don't remember this banger from the Atlantis level being in a previous SpongeBob game, but I could be wrong. Honestly, there isn't too much to say about Underpants Slam, both because there is only 1 hour of game here, and because the gameplay is so shallow. Every level felt exactly the same, and at the heart of it all, you're just picking up items here. I know that this was a budget Xbox Live Arcade game, but good lord, there's just nothing here. Xbox Live Arcade often operated on a try before you buy model, basically giving you a demo before you had to make a purchase and unlock the full game. Here, the game gives you just the first level, which is essentially the full extent of what's on offer here. Even at a cheaper price than a retail game, this is not worth it. Oh, and I have to mention, despite several wikis insisting that this game has some sort of story, there literally is no story present here. I have no idea where people are getting this from. Wikipedia cites the Microsoft Store listing, but I feel like this is literally just marketing fluff that was used to advertise the game, because in the actual game itself, there is no story or dialogue ever present, not even an intro cutscene or anything like that. The game actually could have used this, because yeah, why the hell are they collecting underpants? This game truly sucks from top to bottom. The gameplay is shallow, and even worse, it's just fundamentally not good. If you're making a game where literally all you do is platform, you've got to make sure the platforming doesn't suck. Underpants Slam feels super cheap, even for a budget game. It's just soulless and comes across as a complete cash grab. This is such an easy F tier. Blitz Games needs to be stopped for their crimes against SpongeBob. Drawn to Life SpongeBob SquarePants Edition might be the most bizarre game in all of SpongeBob's video game history. I feel like I'm saying something like this constantly at this point, which I guess is a credit to the variety that gets thrown into most SpongeBob games. As you can tell, this is a game in the Drawn to Life franchise, a short-lived DS franchise that used the touchscreen gimmick in such a smart way to grab attention. The developer, Fifth Cell, had players drawing key elements of the games like enemies and weapons, and that was enough to make the series way more iconic than it ought to have been. If you asked me before this how many Drawn to Life games there were, I would have said, I don't know, like 6 or 7, but in reality there were only 3 mainline Drawn to Life games that were developed by Fifth Cell. The strength of the game's gimmick was enough to make it an icon on the DS, alongside other touchscreen heavy series like Professor Layton and Fifth Cell's other genius creation, Scribblenauts. The origins of this crossover between Drawn to Life and SpongeBob starts with everybody's favourite dead publisher, THQ. The most glaring thing that pops up when you start researching this game is that Fifth Cell did not want to develop it. The first Drawn to Life game came out in 2007 and was a hit, so naturally THQ wanted to milk it. Chasing the dragon that is corporate synergy, they reached out to Fifth Cell, asking for a Drawn to Life game using one of the licenses they had the rights to. Fifth Cell promptly told THQ to f**k off because they had their hearts set on making another original IP, something THQ found to be too risky. Usually in this situation, THQ would make the developer bend the knee, but Fifth Cell were completely independent and could do whatever they wanted. Now, the info I could find stated that they went off and made Locke's Quest. However, I don't think that's true, as Locke's Quest was published by THQ. Would be a bit weird if they ended up publishing this game that they didn't want to make. The source for this on Wikipedia also links to an IGN article that has nothing to do with this stalemate with THQ, so I'm going to pose my own theory. The original IP game they wanted to make that THQ were pushing back on was actually Scribblenauts, which was published by Warner Brothers and released in 2009. Notably, Fifth Cell started developing this game with no publisher attached, which is verified by actual interviews. So to me, it sounds like THQ turned down Scribblenauts in their infinite wisdom. But anyway, this is supposed to be a review of SpongeBob SquarePants Edition. Despite all of the turbulence in trying to get a licensed version of Drawn to Life off the ground, THQ was still enamored with the idea and linked up with Altron once again to be the developer here. Apparently, this entire game was developed with little to no help from the Fifth Cell team, and Altron seemingly did an okay job according to critics. It netted out at an average review score of 68, which was only 5 points lower than the original game and 4 points lower than the DS sequel. It also managed to be 10 points higher than the Wii game. Not bad for something that started life as THQ role-playing as a real-life Mr. Krabs and making every decision purely based on maximizing profits. It probably helps that SpongeBob actually has a decent way to interlink itself with the drawn-to-life formula. Enter Doodlebob. Doodlebob's appearance in the Season 2 episode Frankendoodle is one of the most iconic moments in the show's history, and just so happens to have pretty much the same premise as Drawn to Life. The game starts off the same way as that iconic episode, with an artist dropping a pencil into Bikini Bottom, which falls into Patrick's dumb hands, where he proceeds to immediately bring Doodlebob back to life. It all pretty much acts as a sequel to the episode, and it's an idea a million times better than turning Atlantis SquarePantis into a game. You end up drawing a hero to take on Doodlebob, or choosing from several default character options, before SpongeBob is captured and you're off to rescue him and the rest of the Bikini Bottom citizens who've been taken. Immediately, you're introduced to the gimmick that made Drawn to Life approximately the 75th best-selling DS game. If you don't like drawing, this might not be the game for you. I'm very much not artistically talented, which is why I bounced off the Drawn to Life games quite quickly as a kid, and I found myself more enamored with its cousin Scribblenauts. Your first introduction, as I mentioned, is drawing your character, which I chose to participate in, and made this abomination who gets named Underpants. However, this is the only time in the game where they give you the choice to just select a pre-made option, several of which are great references to the show. The rest of the game, well, you're forced to draw. This starts off as a neat little gimmick, but for me, it quickly wore out its welcome. Pretty early on, you'll find yourself in a Bikini Bottom hub world, where you can spend coins collected in levels at the Krusty Krab for extra lives, and various colour palettes for your drawings. Amongst this hub world is a house that is gifted to your character for some reason, which you, no surprise, have to draw. You then fill up this house with a bunch of furniture, which you again, no surprise, have to draw. Some of the things that get added to your house have actual functionality, while other stuff is just added for the sake of decorating. You're constantly bombarded with these items, and you unlock more crap after each level you beat. And this is where my problem came in. The amount of drawing you do here is too much. Yeah, I get it, the game's called Drawn to Life. No shit, you're going to be constantly drawing. My issue is most of the drawing isn't fun, it just feels like busy work. Drawing your own video game character? That's cool. Basically the fantasy of every childhood artist. Drawing a bunch of NPC characters that appear when you defeat Doodlebob's minions? That's still kinda cool, I guess. But when you're asked to draw slingshots, boulders, or the endless piles of platforms, seriously, how many goddamn times was the game going to ask me to draw some variety of platform? The other category that's a big offender is helmets and shoes. You draw way too many of these, and by the end I was just over it, resorting to the most generic options possible. The idea of filling a game world with all of your hand-drawn creations is objectively awesome, but this game almost always makes you draw the boring stuff in games. Is anybody really passionate about drawing their 5 millionth platform? The frequency that these are thrown at you can get pretty tiresome too. It feels like your platforming, which is what the actual gameplay is here, is interrupted every 5 minutes to draw something. It really interrupts the flow. Not enjoying the drawing elements of a game called Drawn to Life already puts this one on shaky ground for me, but the reason I was able to push right through to the end was because the platforming is actually quite enjoyable. It's not revolutionary, but it is downright fun at its core. As expected, you've got your basic combat elements like punching with Y and a simple ground pound. Combat never evolves past mashing to kill an enemy or jumping on their heads, with the only depth coming when they introduce something like an enemy with a helmet on, so you're forced to melee them. When you face off against one of Doodlebob's minions, they won't actually die. Instead, they fall into a stunned state where you have to swipe over them on the touchscreen to turn them good. And then that's it as far as the combat goes, really. I did find it interesting that for a game so focused on the touchscreen with the drawing, outside of that you really don't use it all that much. Platforming is done via the face buttons, and one of the only other notable uses of the touchscreen is when you clean up this black gunk. Cleaning 100% of the black gunk is one of the goals for each level, but it's not mandatory. The same goes for rescuing Bikini Bottom citizens. Each level has 3 of these, but you only need to rescue 1 per level to unlock a key that allows you to finish the level. Rescuing these citizens helps fill out your hub world that you return to between levels, and it gives you more items for your house, which really didn't interest me. After freeing SpongeBob from his brief Doodlebob imprisonment, the game introduces you to helper powers. Activating this with SpongeBob allows you to draw a protective square around you to deflect incoming attacks, and once you beat this first level, you also gain access to the helper powers of Patrick or Squidward. 1 character can be chosen per level, with Patrick being thrown like a ninja star, and Squidward stunning enemies with his beautiful clarinet playing. You've also got certain crates and areas that can only be accessed by activating a helper power. Outside of those optional areas, there really isn't much need for these special abilities, which surprised me. Outside of making some of the trickier sections slightly easier, the helper abilities weren't something I often thought about using. You could probably remove them from the game and nothing would have been lost. When it comes down to it, you're really just doing basic 2D platforming around the levels. Again, it's not revolutionary, but it controls tightly and level design feels well thought out. There's a nice rhythm to how each level ends up playing out. They haven't reinvented the wheel here, but they've executed the basics so well that I was having a great time. I guess they tried to spice things up with their power-up system, but this kind of misses the mark. There are a bunch of these in the game. You've got stuff like a karate glove that makes your attack stronger and can be used to destroy certain objects, a helmet that protects you from falling objects and spiked ceilings, spring shoes to jump higher, a hat that makes you glide, a wall jump, a ninja mask that turns you invisible, and a bubble blower ranged attack. The biggest issue with the power-ups is that not a lot of thought has been put into these power-ups being used throughout levels. In fact, a lot of them have zero use outside of specific sections where the game force feeds you the specific power-up. There's no point in the game where I would ever want the wall jump other than where it's specifically required. This is an issue when the game is just randomly dropping power-ups constantly. By the final few levels, you've got like a dozen different power-ups being randomly spawned after defeating enemies, and it was just kind of dumb. Like, cool, I've got the helmet now, which has absolutely no use because there aren't any falling projectiles and no spiked ceilings. This game doesn't have the kind of level design where using all of these random traversal items actually plays into how you tackle the level, which is kind of a shame as it feels like most of this system goes to waste outside of the bubble blower. Of course, we also get boss battles here, which are bad, but mostly inoffensive. The biggest issue is that they're simple and very easy to cheese. Like the first Doodlebob fight, all you need to do is hit him a few times, and then scrub him on the touchscreen. It's so easy to lock him in a damage loop, so I ended up beating this ridiculously fast. He then returns at the end of the game for a repeat of this exact boss battle, with the only difference being that he spawns a bunch of minions. The game gives you a super suit for this that allows you to shoot infinite projectiles, which kinda offsets the extra difficulty that the minions would have brought. Then to finish the game off, he turns into a big guy for some reason.
Big guy.
But all you need to do here is spam the attack button. It's all pretty poorly thought out, and clearly something they felt they needed to shoehorn in. Drawn to Life SpongeBob SquarePants edition is split into 4 different worlds: Bikini Bottom, the jungle, deep sea, and space. Yeah, this game gets a little weird at the end. Overall though, there's a very nice variety to the worlds here, and each level amongst those worlds feels pretty unique. There's also a 5th world unlocked in the post-game where you take on Squid Doodle. While it has its flaws, most of them that are found in the gameplay are pretty inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. A lot of the issues are mostly that Altron introduced systems and gameplay elements that don't get used properly. Instead, my biggest frustrations were with 2 specific levels in the game. The first is an annoying level where a hurricane force wind is periodically blowing and it's constantly pushing you back. These kind of levels always suck, and this game is not an exception to that. It just makes for a very tedious level. The much worse level, or levels I should say, is when you head onto the Flying Dutchman's ship and start encountering these ghost enemies. These enemies can't be defeated with your attacks, only by ringing these bells can you defeat them, that are found scattered around, And even then, the enemy has to be on screen for this to work. Getting through these levels was brutal and just not fun at all. They were clearly trying to do a Super Mario World Ghost House type thing here, but they executed it so poorly. Not that it needed it, Altron offered a couple breaks from the platforming gameplay, as if the drawing wasn't already enough. We've got our obligatory shmup level here, and then a series of car/minecart levels that appear basically once per world. These minecart levels are played via touch controls, having to swipe up to jump gaps, ram enemies, and tapping to remove obstacles. These are fine, I guess. They get kind of difficult because you don't have a lot of time to react to the things being thrown in your path, but it's not something that will stick with you. So do I like Drawn to Life SpongeBob SquarePants edition? Yeah, I do. Also, side note, shout out to whoever decided the title would use SpongeBob's government name rather than just being SpongeBob edition. While I don't like the drawing aspect and think it's implemented in a kind of boring way, and there are parts of the platforming gameplay that I'm critical of, for the most part, all of these negative elements don't really get in the way of some pretty fun platforming. It controls really well, and the devs did a solid job of sprinkling in small twists to the levels to keep it feeling fresh across its 4 to 5 hour length. They also jammed this thing full of references. A lot of the characters you rescue are iconic characters. Level locations also include references to iconic settings like Flying Dutchman's ship, Rock Bottom, and Kelp Forest. Without the need to draw a million different platforms constantly and the awful ghost levels, Drawn to Life SpongeBob SquarePants edition probably could have squeaked into B tier. I just really enjoyed the platforming, and I'd go as far as saying this is my favourite 2D SpongeBob platformer so far. Unfortunately, all of those negatives were enough to knock it down to C tier. For what feels like the 10 millionth time in this video, we've got another contender for what could be the most bizarre SpongeBob game. As I've touched on previously, we're in the era where SpongeBob games are being pumped out based on TV specials, or in this game's case, a double-length episode. In SpongeBob vs. the Big One, the gang is swept away by a giant wave, with SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward washing up on a remote island where they eventually meet the surfing legend Jack Kahuna Laguna, who's played by Johnny Depp. Jack trains them to surf a mythical wave called the Big One, and they end up catching this all the way back to Bikini Bottom. While it's a little weird to base a game on a 22-minute episode, the premise kind of makes sense. You could go for a surfing game, or you could even do a 3D platformer as the crew encounter a few pretty cool locations that really could have been expanded on in a game. And there's the added benefit of a Sandy and Mr. Krabs side story that could have padded things out. Instead, what we received with SpongeBob vs. the Big One Beach Party Cook-Off was a Cooking Mama clone.
Wow, even better than Mama.
Now this is actually a no-brainer idea. SpongeBob is a fry cook, as if you wouldn't copy Cooking Mama's formula at some point. But leveraging this special episode for it is weird. There's almost no cooking in the episode except for a brief moment at the beginning where Mr. Krabs tries to sell Krabby Patties at the beach. However, the SpongeBob brand was riding high at the time, and these special episodes were being promoted like crazy on Nickelodeon, and receiving viewership to justify it. SpongeBob vs. the Big One was the 5th highest rated telecast for Nickelodeon in 2009. While it does seem weird, attaching the Big One branding to this game kinda makes sense from a marketing perspective, and the developers here, a dev I'd never heard of called The Fizz Factor, set things up in the game in a way that kind of makes sense. Instead of trying to adapt the episode, the game acts basically like a sequel. Jack Kahuna Laguna is throwing a beach party, and both Mr. Krabs and Plankton want to cater for the event. To decide who will do the cooking, Jack holds a contest to determine who should do it. Outside of Jack being present here, this game really has nothing to do with the episode. In fact, outside of the US, this game is called Frantic Fry Cook, so the US name is a little bit misleading. As part of the narrative, Plankton has tried to rope his cousins into helping him cook, but he refuses to pay them, so they go to Krabs, who's willing to pay them slightly more than nothing. This is actually important as Plankton's cousins serve as a gameplay role here. To show all of this story, we actually get an opening cutscene that's a mixture between a slideshow And then there's some actual animation and voice acting for SpongeBob. I was kind of digging this cutscene, even if it did look super lo-fi. I just appreciated that we had this in a SpongeBob DS game. As you move on from this and get your first taste of gameplay, the game gives you a short and pretty unhelpful tutorial. The tutorial consists of one tomato slicing minigame and that's it. The game then just throws you into the deep end for your first shift. Oh yeah, the game is broken up into shifts, which are essentially the game's levels. You're expected to serve a set amount of customers during this time, with how well you cook resulting in you earning money that can be spent on upgrading your restaurant. You actually get to build out a menu here that alters what you cook and what actions you're taking during a shift. Of course, you start out with a default menu, but I found that you're basically unlocking a new menu item to purchase with your money after almost every shift. The more times you cook these recipes, the more you upgrade them, eventually leveling them up to deluxe recipes, which are worth more money. The other thing you'll be unlocking after a shift is decor items for your restaurant. These don't really get seen, but unlocking and then using these sets that have been completed apply a bonus to your shift and give you more money, and some other benefits during a shift. If you're not familiar with Cooking Mama, this was, much like Drawn to Life, another one of those series that debuted and burned brightly in the DS era, becoming an icon for the platform before quickly fading. 3 of these games dropped on the DS, with 2 3DS sequels also popping up. There was also some weird-ass Nintendo Switch and PS4 revival of the series that incorporated blockchain bullshit, which was delisted as well. Basically what this series consisted of was a sequence of cooking-themed minigames that emphasized the DS's touchscreen and required the player to complete them under intense time pressure. The first game actually didn't review all that well, but that didn't stop it from cracking the top 50 highest selling DS games. Here you do basically the same thing, except the game is framed around working kitchen shifts at the Krusty Krab. Man, I always wanted to play Just Put the Fries in the Bag simulator. Orders come into the kitchen, which is broken up into several different sections to prepare the meal, each one manned by Patrick, SpongeBob, Squidward, or Sandy. These characters are guiding Plankton's cousins, who are supposed to be preparing the meals, but they inevitably run into trouble and require your help to get the job done. Once they run into trouble, that's where you jump into the minigames, which asks you to tap, swipe, spin, and rub the touchscreen in various ways to complete the dishes. One thing to note about trying to play this game in this day and age is that some of the minigames don't translate well to using a mouse. Anything involving mixing or stirring was particularly difficult for me. This is definitely one of those DS games where playing on the original hardware is significantly preferred if possible. But yeah, there's not a whole lot to say about the cooking minigames. They're all bite-sized events where you're doing pretty basic tasks against a timer. They work well enough for the most part when you're chopping, flipping, rolling, and deep frying. There was just one game I despised, and I refuse to believe anybody could consistently complete this. The jigsaw puzzle game is ridiculous. I have no idea how anybody completed this in the insane time limit they give you. Outside of the minigames, managing the plankton workers is a significant part of the game. As I said, they genuinely do a lot of the work for you, especially as you level them up. The plankton workers get better the more you play, particularly if you're making the same kinds of dishes requiring the same kinds of actions. The plankton cousins get better, and you'll need to step in less to help them out, creating this kind of weird aspect of the game where a genuine mechanic involves you just watching the AI play the game while you sit around. It's like it evolves from Just Put the Fries in the Bag simulator to Corporate Middle Manager simulator. Through my first handful of shifts, I was having quite a lot of fun as I learned to master the different minigames and wrapped my head around the optimal ways to handle things in the kitchen, but then things kind of started to fizzle out. Beach Party Cook-Off is basically one of those handheld games that sort of died off once the iPhone and the App Store really took off. At the heart of it, this is really just a neat little time waster. It's a public transport game, something you're supposed to play on your DS for 30 minutes to an hour each day while you ride the bus to school. It's perfectly fine and fun, but a lot of these just disappeared once you could download stuff like Doodle Jump on your phone. Beach Party Cook-Off is absolutely not designed to be played for long sessions, and that's fine. Nothing wrong with designing a game to be played in short bursts. Unfortunately, I don't think Fizz Factor made the best decisions to optimize how fruitful those short sessions feel. Firstly, I think shifts just take way too long. The game is broken up into 5 episodes, and in the first episode it took me over half an hour to get to the game's first challenge, because you need to serve 7 to 9 dishes every shift, which takes surprisingly long. The required number of dishes also increases as you progress further in the game. When you get to a challenge, the game asks you to play all of the minigames needed to cook a complete dish from start to finish, with no breaks in between. You also need to hit a minimum rating to pass. Episodes don't end with that first challenge though. No, instead you'll have to do a bunch of these building up to an end of episode judge.
Call the judge and get some fudge.
Fizz Factor dug deep with the references for these judges, using characters like Gene Scallop and Kevin, which is cool, but it takes way too long to get to them. The game is about 10 hours long, so it's going to take you around 2 hours per episode, and that feels like it flies against the short burst nature of the game. Personally, I think that they should have made these at least like half the length, which would have helped with the game's biggest issue. You're just doing the same mini games over and over and over. New recipes will often introduce new mini games, but new mini games are very slowly drip fed to you. In my first hour of playing Beach Party Cook-Off, 1 new mini game was introduced. I found that when I progressed to episode 2, they started to introduce more new mini games, but it took way too long to get there. On top of that, as I started to play through episode 2, the introduction of minigames dried up. So to me, it seemed like they were just going to dump a new batch every couple of hours. The other issue is that your gameplay variety is entirely dependent on what dishes you have on your menu, as that determines the minigames that get played. The game encourages you to optimize this, either for making the most money, or for being the easiest for your plankton workers to cook. What they don't try to optimize is gameplay variety, which often means you'll have a menu that has you halfway through the game, just doing the exact same minigames you were playing 5 minutes into Beach Party Cook-Off. They have an impressively deep roster of recipes to unlock here, with a lot of them being direct references to the show. So it sucks that actually cooking them can be a bit frustrating when it's just doing the same thing yet again. Once you get to episode 2, they add an extra bit of spice in the form of a section where Gary is organizing the order cards, which you can match up via color for certain power-ups. There might also be additional gameplay tweaks in further episodes, but I never got there. 4 hours of Beach Party Cook-Off was more than enough for me. Apparently the game has 25 different minigames, and while I couldn't find a definitive answer for how many minigames were in the first Cooking Mama game, it seems like there were at least 4 times as many. This is often a huge issue with licensed games that are trying to copy a formula like this. You see it pretty commonly with Mario Party clones. You really can't just pop out a clone with a quarter of the minigames. It really makes the whole thing fall apart. While I might sound a bit harsh on Beach Party Cook-Off, especially with me tapping out less than halfway through, I actually did quite enjoy this. It's great in short bursts, and I think if Fizz Factor had shortened the episodes in half, it would have been a perfect short burst game. Some extra minigames also wouldn't have hurt because 25 is far too few, especially if you're going to make the game 10 hours long. In a perfect world, this could have been a B tier game, but instead I'm going to have to settle for C tier. Continuing the trend of Nick and THQ trying to synergize and release a game every single time there's a special episode or TV movie, next up we've got SpongeBob's Truth or Square. Just like Atlantis SquarePantis, Truth or Square was an hour-long made-for-TV movie developed to coincide with the series' 10th anniversary, which they actually missed. Truth or Square aired on November 6, 2009, about 6 months after the actual anniversary of the first episode airing. The episode is kinda meta, with SpongeBob and co getting locked inside the Krusty Krab while preparing for the 11th anniversary celebration. While trying to escape, we see a bunch of flashbacks to moments we've never seen before, while at the same time we also get a bunch of Patchy the Pirate live action shenanigans. The live action segments are crammed full of celeb cameos, with people like Rosario Dawson, LeBron, Tina Fey, Will Ferrell, and Robin Williams showing up. And there's also Pink, who performs We've Got Scurvy, which was the only thing I remembered about this special before rewatching it again. Pink apparently really hates this song according to a 2023 interview, which is hilarious because the entire gag in Truth or Square is that she hates that she has to be on Patchy's TV show. The celeb cameo spamming seems to have paid off because 7.7 million people watched the premiere, making it the 5th highest viewed SpongeBob episode of all time. Personally, I think this special is awful. It's way too focused on Patchy, and the premise of the episode is pretty underwhelming for something that's supposed to be a 10th anniversary special. I also had no idea how they were going to turn this into a game. My guess was they'd leverage the name just like they did with Beach Party Cook-Off, without actually making it a full-on tie-in. The 360, Wii, and PSP versions of Truth or Square dropped on October 26, about a week and a half before the episode premiered. The most exciting thing about this game is that our glorious kings at Heavy Iron Studios have returned to the SpongeBob franchise. They developed the 360 and Wii versions, while the PSP game was technically developed by Barking Lizard's technology, but they were clearly instructed to just copy whatever Heavy Iron was doing. Although there are technically exclusive levels in the PSP game that were cut from the home console version, so the PSP version is kind of the definitive way to play if you can handle some downgrades in other areas. It's also got a multiplayer mode where a second player can jump in and play some minigames. There's also no official word on why Truth or Square completely ignored the PS3. I think it's probably a classic case of the PS3 getting dominated by the other two consoles at this point in time in terms of sales, while also being very difficult to develop for. Heavy Iron clearly did not have a lot of time to develop Truth or Square, something I'll touch on more, so they probably just chose to focus on the easy to develop platforms that had a bigger install base. Interestingly, there's evidence that a PS2 port was initially planned, but I'm sure they decided that 2009 was a bit late to be doing this. And the last thing I want to touch on for the behind the scenes history for Truth or Square is that just like Underpants Slam, this game was relisted after THQ Nordic grabbed the rights. You can still purchase this game on Xbox, but I refuse to do that out of principle here, because 20 USD or 30 AUD is a ludicrous price for a 2009 game. For context, I literally paid $39 total for both Cosmic Shake and the Patrick Star game on Steam the day that I recorded this. But enough about ancient history, let's jump into the actual game. Almost immediately, my suspicions about the game were confirmed. Like Beach Party Cook-Off, there are elements in the story that tie into the special that the game was named after, but ultimately, it's kind of just doing its own thing. The crew are still celebrating the Krusty Krab's anniversary here, but that's pretty much one of the only elements retained. For some reason, the anniversary celebrations are being held at SpongeBob's house, where SpongeBob has seemingly lost the Krabby Patty formula. Plankton wants to help out, so he taps into SpongeBob's memories to try and help him remember where it is. This results in all of the game's levels being flashbacks to iconic moments from the show, and yes, these are genuinely iconic flashbacks, well, sorta, rather than the never before seen flashbacks in the special. This game does the dream world trope way better than Creature from the Krusty Krab. In fact, comparing those two games is just unfair. Truth or Square is so far out of its league. Possibly helps that Doug Lawrence, also known for voicing Plankton, wrote the game's script. As I said, each level is themed after a moment from the show, but unfortunately the game gets a little weird with these things. Obviously, some of the episodes of the show are going to need to be expanded upon to actually flesh out a full game level, but there are so many levels here that really have nothing to do with the episode. A good example is the hash-slinging slasher level. You could easily do a really spooky level here based on the actual episode, but instead, SpongeBob somehow ends up in rock bottom and then gets swallowed by a giant creature. There's a level that's supposed to be based on Tea at the Tree Dome, and they hype it up as showing SpongeBob and Sandy's first meeting. And then the level proceeds to take place inside of Kelp Forest and have nothing to do with that episode. I think my favourite level would have to be the one based on SpongeBob meeting Santa. Firstly, that officially makes Truth or Square a Christmas game in my eyes, and secondly, all of the NPCs in this level act like they've been lobotomized. Ultimately, the levels being show references here just kind of feels like cheap fan service. They'll mention a show moment and then have the level be something entirely made up, which just kind of feels strange to me. It's almost like they should have copied the TV special and had these levels be flashbacks to moments we've never actually seen before. Visually, I found the actual cutscenes here to look a little rough, but a whole lot of effort has been put into these cutscenes, and they're not just blink and you'll miss it clips. When you jump into the gameplay, the visuals are actually really nice. It feels super authentic to the show, and it's easily the best looking SpongeBob game so far. Even outside of the visual fidelity, it's clear Heavy Iron have brought their passion for SpongeBob back to this game. It's really the first time in a long time that a console SpongeBob game truly feels like a SpongeBob game. After all of the muck that we've had to slog through recently, returning to a Heavy Iron 3D platformer was bliss. I imagine this is what it feels like to be a heroin addict relapsing, or somebody being released from prison. While that passion and knowledge of what makes SpongeBob such an iconic franchise is still here after Heavy Iron spent 5 years away, do they still have the juice when it comes to gameplay? Well, that answer is a bit complicated. For anybody who's played Battle for Bikini Bottom or the movie game, you'll feel a sense of familiarity immediately. Like when you're hit with the contractually obligated tongue sliding section pretty much straight away. SpongeBob's arsenal of attacks feels familiar but upgraded. He's got the spatula slam attack as well as a spin attack, something that can also be used in the platforming to help SpongeBob glide across larger gaps. SpongeBob also unlocks a cannon attack that gives him a ranged option. This requires ammo to use, and unfortunately, actually lining up shots is super fiddly, to the point where its use in combat is almost completely diminished. And frustratingly, the combat also gets dragged down quite often due to a very janky camera. It's really bad in tight spaces, and I often found it flipping out and showing me the most bizarre angles. One of the great things about Battle for Bikini Bottom, and to a lesser extent the movie game, is that Heavy Iron expanded things beyond just playing as SpongeBob. You had Patrick and Sandy join in with unique abilities in Battle for Bikini Bottom, and while the story of the movie kind of dictated that Patrick could be the only other playable character, it was still nice to have another option. In Truth or Square, you get none of that, instead bringing a suite of power-ups that temporarily bring Patrick, Sandy, and Squidward into the gameplay. There's an invincibility and strength power-up that is entirely SpongeBob focused, but you also get a Patrick power-up that turns him into the hammer item from Smash Bros. You've got a tornado spinning power-up with Sandy, and then also a Squidward power-up where he destroys everything around him with his awful music. Mr. Krabs also shows up briefly in a single level to sort of act as your guide, but I was pretty disappointed with how sparingly he was used. One of the biggest changes to Heavy Iron's SpongeBob formula is the gameplay focus. The previous games were squarely focused on platforming first, with some basic combat sprinkled in as a formality. Here the roles are reversed. Most of the game is dedicated to smashing up robots, with so much gameplay really just being centered around needing to defeat a wave of enemies in order to unlock a door or remove a roadblock that then allows you to continue with the level. While the focus has changed, there haven't been nearly enough improvements to the combat to make this change work well. The combat is pretty much just as basic as what we've seen previously. Giving SpongeBob a couple of new moves really doesn't upgrade the experience. The platforming side of things is still super tight, and there's also an air of jankiness with some of the special sections. Most notable were these gumball traversal sections, which had my mind drifting back to stuff like the Bubble Bowl and the Cruise Bubble, which were perfectly usable, but often just felt slightly off and had a little bit of a charm to it. Truth or Square drip feeds a lot of these abilities and actually uses this to gatekeep certain parts of levels, forcing you to return later on once you have more powers to unlock everything. I think the most interesting part of Truth or Square's combat, and also an illustration of how the combat was the main focus here, is that there's technically a co-op mode. A second player can join the action as Plankton, where you can stun, zap, and grab enemies. When you stun an enemy, they will obviously be stunned for a period of time. Zapping deals out some damage, and when an enemy is grabbed, you can shake them or slam them, which will also stun them. As is customary, you've got a currency to collect throughout levels, which gets used back at the hub world to purchase health upgrades or unlockable costumes for SpongeBob, Patrick, Sandy, Squidward, Mr. Krabs, and even Gary. These are also references to the show, and it's a real shame that everybody outside of SpongeBob is barely utilized, because there are some really fun costumes here. Spending coins on health upgrades is a bit pointless too, because this game is super easy. It was rare for me to ever die, and I played the entire main game with a default health without any issues. The other big problem is how generous they are with handing out lives. By the end of the first level, my extra lives were in the double digits, and by the end of the game I had 40 lives total. Another disappointing change from the previous Heavy Iron games is that levels are pretty much 100% linear. While there are some side areas that are unlocked by SpongeBob's gained powers, these amount to little more than a single room just slightly off to the side. Outside of that, you're really just going from A to B here. There are a couple of side distractions, like finding one sleeping Patrick per level, which actually has zero gameplay benefits unless you're playing the Xbox version, which in that case you'll need to find them all for an achievement. There's also items that unlock concept art. The main goal is to collect happiness objects, which are again references to the show, and these are supposed to jog SpongeBob's memory about where the formula is. Each level has one happiness object given to you for completing the level. Alongside those, you also have 2 Tiki challenges per level that also give you a happiness object. Now I know what you're probably thinking. We've got an old-fashioned Goofy Goober token mechanic here.
I'm sorry, SpongeBob. You don't have enough Goofy Goober tokens.
But actually, the game never gatekeeps progression behind happiness objects. I was able to play the entire game from start to finish without ever doing a single Tiki challenge. In a very strange move, the game doesn't allow you to do Tiki challenges the first time playing through a level. Instead, you have to come back a second time to do it. This is insane to me, especially because this is a ridiculously short game. You'll beat all of the main levels within a few hours, making it one of the shortest SpongeBob home console games ever, and significantly shorter than Battle for Bikini Bottom or the movie game. With such a short playtime, why not just make these challenges compulsory parts of levels? I'm not even sure why anybody would go back and play through these challenges. These challenges are really just dull time wasters that ask you to destroy objects, collect coins, or maybe survive waves of enemies for less than a minute. They're dull, and getting extra happiness objects is pretty pointless. All it really does is open up a couple of extra areas in SpongeBob's house, which gives you some extra lives. You can also upgrade the furniture in the house with SpongeBob's coins, which was similarly pointless. I think a lot of the negatives I have for this game has reared its head due to some development issues that were clearly on display here. It's not hard to see that a lot of the ideas and assets from their previous SpongeBob games were reused here, and it feels like a lot of that was necessary because this game radiates made under a time crunch energy. Making levels a lot more basic, linear, and focused on combat compared to the previous 3D platformers no doubt would have made this much easier to develop quickly. Instead of making levels with a bunch of branching areas and a need to create platforming challenges, they could just keep things simple with players going from A to B and whacking some enemies along the way. The game also just ends super abruptly. Like they realized they got to a point where they couldn't develop any more levels, so they just decided to end things. There's no build up to the final level here at all. You'll go to start the next level, and then without any fanfare at all, you'll be doing a final boss battle focused level against Plankton inside of a mecha chum bucket. The final level itself isn't even bad, but it just shows up out of the blue, and it ends up having no real weight to it because it's just sort of dropped on you. Considering there were several cut levels that have been found in the finished game, it really does sound like they ran out of time and just had to ship whatever they had. Hell, one of the cut levels is featured in the launch trailer. You can see the shortcuts taken in stuff like the music as well. I love the soundtracks for Heavy Iron's other 2 games, but here they almost entirely rely on ripping tracks from the show, which makes it feel authentic, but also kind of underwhelming, at least for me personally. I also wonder how focused they were on this game as a studio. Based on a video posted to YouTube by one of the devs, it seems like this game started development sometime in 2008, which was around the time they would have been wrapping up production on Wall-E, which released in late June. After Wall-E, they moved on to 2 projects, Truth or Square and Up, which would release a few months before Truth or Square. It was pretty rare for Heavy Iron to ever release 2 games in the same calendar year, with the only other time it happened being in 2004 when they released the SpongeBob movie game and Incredibles. Considering the SpongeBob movie heavily recycles Battle for Bikini Bottom, it probably wasn't as difficult to juggle developing those 2 games simultaneously compared to this. Unfortunately, this is by far the worst Heavy Iron SpongeBob game, but that doesn't make this a bad SpongeBob game. Far from it, actually. While it has a bunch of shortcomings and kind of just feels like a weird spin-off DLC for their previous SpongeBob games, there's still a whole lot to like here. Heavy Iron have still proven themselves to be the best at capturing the essence of SpongeBob and then bringing it to video games, and the platforming is as good as it's ever been, even though it's a shame that the focus has been shifted over to combat. And while the combat is pretty basic, it's not like it's offensively bad or anything. It's functional but boring, which is still a step up from a lot of other licensed games in this era. It doesn't quite live up to the standards set by Battle for Bikini Bottom or even the SpongeBob movie game, and this might be controversial, but I also think Revenge of the Flying Dutchman has Truth or Square beat. I think it's ultimately how short and rushed this game feels that really hurts the experience. If THQ and Nick had given Heavy Iron like 6 months or even a year longer to develop this, I easily could have seen this being S or A tier. Instead, Truth or Square has to settle for B tier. Outrun are back for their 4th and final SpongeBob game, and Truth or Square also marks their final Nickelodeon game in general. The plot is almost identical to the home console version, with SpongeBob yet again losing the Krabby Patty formula, Plankton offering to help, and then SpongeBob playing through his memories. Impressively, a lot of things are kept the same here. Outrun even included their own tongue-sliding sections. We get a really nice opening cutscene, and while it doesn't have the flashy voice acting, I'd almost argue that I like this cutscene more than the ones featured in Heavy Iron's version. Just like the home console version, all of the levels are based on moments from the show, and while we once again deviate from what actually happened in those episodes, it feels like these levels are slightly more faithful to the episodes they're supposed to be recreating. We've even got the Krusty Krab level that was cut from the home console version. Each level is a combo of combat and platforming, but there's arguably a worse balance between the two here. Outrun's version feels very combat focused, and you don't get many dedicated platforming segments. At best, you'll get some occasional jumps across bottomless pits. For a DS game, Truth or Square is surprisingly light on touch controls, or at least forced touch controls. Combat can be executed via face buttons or touch controls, and I'd argue that the face controls are way more superior. Players are asked to draw specific shapes to pull off SpongeBob's attacks, and it just feels awkward and clunky. Even on an actual DS, I couldn't imagine this would be fun when the game is so combat focused. There are other small uses of the touchscreen. You've got Plankton following along just like in the home console version, and here he gets utilized in the gameplay. There's times where you'll need to tap icons and Plankton will raise platforms for you, and he can even be used to grab items out of your reach, or that are just far away from you if you're lazy, by tapping on the desired item. Levels are not as flashy as the home console version, and they feel like they live in that weird grey area that games like Super Mario 3D Land or Sackboy: A Big Adventure live in, something that Miyamoto basically described as a 3D Mario that plays like a 2D Mario. You've got mostly linear levels that you'd see in a 2D platformer, but obviously you've got a 3D environment and 3D movement. I was pretty impressed at how good these levels looked and how fleshed out they were. I've played quite a few 3D Nintendo DS games at this point, and often they can feel pretty bare, which seems like a sacrifice for getting a genuine 3D game up and running on the platform. Truth or Square is packed full of enemies and side content to explore. Levels actually feature more branching paths than the home console version. One of my only gripes with the weird 2D 3D combo level design is that the 2D linear nature often means you lack a lot of platforming freedom. There are times where you'll attempt to jump and think you're going to land safely, only to smack into an invisible wall and discover that the game wants you to follow a very strict path. And similar to the extra branching paths, this version has a lot more depth in other areas of the gameplay. For starters, the gumball bungee that appears a few times in Heavy Iron's game is used way more often. There's the basic use of getting across gaps, but Ultron also have you going vertical with it. It's not a revolutionary addition, but it adds an extra layer of verticality to levels. Speaking of verticality, occasionally SpongeBob needs to hop inside a bubble to get across gaps, or to get to higher layers of a level. This utilizes the DS's microphone, which I just mapped to a button, so I can't speak to how well the intended control scheme works here. The increased depth is on display with SpongeBob's combat as well. We've got the same 3 basic attacks here, with the spatula slam, the spin attack, and the cannon ranged attack all appearing again, but rather than just spamming whatever you want, which was usually just the spin attack for me, each enemy encounter is unique. While you can destroy any robot enemy with any attack, each enemy has a specific weakness which kind of funnels you towards using different attacks. Sure, you can stand there and smack an enemy with the spin attack, or you could just use the cannon attack that they're weak to and defeat them in a shot or two. SpongeBob can once again absorb water and spray it on things to activate various effects, but rather than being used like twice, this is a core feature of most levels in the DS game. You've got the sponge platforms, water-powered machines, fires you need to put out, just a whole lot more creativity in its use, and it doesn't feel like an afterthought. I actually didn't even touch on this feature in my review of Truth or Square on the Wii because it was so insignificant. Here it's actually a core feature. Happy tokens return as well, and like a lot of mechanics, I feel like it's utilized better on the DS. Instead of purely being used as a currency for purchasing health upgrades and weirdly upgrading SpongeBob's household furniture, the coins fill up a meter during levels. Once filled, SpongeBob becomes buff, and he unlocks the equivalent of the strength power-up in the home console version. It feels like you earn the strength power-up here, and because you have to grind up the right to use it, it made me appreciate it a lot more, and I was way more focused on trying to make it last for as long as possible. Once again, the power-up goes away if you take a single hit from an enemy. You can also have this power-up carry across levels, so there's even more incentive to be careful with it. Of course, happy tokens are also used to purchase those health upgrades, as well as some other collectibles and items. Heavy Iron included a few mostly meaningless things to collect in levels, and Ultron follows suit with memory fragments. There are a handful of fragments scattered around each level, and you need to collect all of these to unlock a JPEG screenshot from an episode. It's very underwhelming. The power-ups that see cameos from Patrick, Squidward, and Sandy return, with Mr. Krabs also joining in now. Instead of being a combat power-up, these are more focused on activating platforms or removing roadblocks. Patrick still has his Smash Bros hammer, Squidward plays awful music, and Sandy still unleashes a tornado. Mr. Krabs gets to rip through bags of money that block your way. Their powers are all mostly used to activate these devices found in levels. It's especially rare to encounter a stretch of level where they can be used for combat, and the game actually immediately switches you back to SpongeBob once the device is activated. Each memory ends with either a boss battle or a minigame that's exclusive to the DS. The boss battles play out almost identically to the home console version, and they're pretty bland. The minigames, on the other hand, can be kind of interesting, mostly because they tie the levels much more closely to the episode in ways that a boss battle or platforming level could never. For example, you've got a jellyfishing minigame that has you catching jellyfish, or the talent show minigame, which is a rhythm game. There's even a recreation of the Fry Cook games that has you doing a bunch of touchscreen actions. These are hardly amazing when judged in isolation, but I loved that Ultron was trying something different to make it feel like you were actually experiencing these episodes of the show. While I think Ultron do a mostly pretty great job here, and have one-upped Heavy Iron in a number of areas, it's definitely not perfect. And one of the most notable areas is the sound effects and some of the cutscene animations. Almost all of the sound effects in cutscenes are so bizarre and ill-fitting. Just listen to Squidbot after it gets defeated. Then you've got Squidward fancy walking into SpongeBob's house. And the icing on the cake is Patrick exposing himself like a pervert. It's a shame that this is Ultron's final SpongeBob and Nickelodeon game, because they struck gold here. SpongeBob's Truth or Square on the Nintendo DS is easily the best handheld SpongeBob game so far, and I'd almost go as far as saying it's better than the Wii and 360 version. There's a lot more content here, and while it definitely leverages Heavy Iron's work on the flagship versions, Altron managed to springboard off that and make it a lot deeper mechanically in a number of ways. Most devs would just copy the formula one for one and then call it a day. While it is really fun, if I'm being brutally honest, the game can be a little basic and the gameplay doesn't meaningfully change after your intro levels. Very small tweaks get tossed in, but it quickly settles into a routine, and while it's fun, it does start to wear thin by the end. With that said, this is still a B tier game. With so many bizarre SpongeBob games appearing in part 2 of my quest to review every game, it's only fitting that we finish off with a couple of very weird entries. First up, we've got SpongeBob's Boating Bash, developed by Impulse Games. At first, Impulse Games were a super mysterious developer to me. I could only find them attached to 2 other games in their history, Monster Garage in 2004 and MX World Tour in 2005. That left a full 5-year gap before the release of Boating Bash, but as the internet has been known to do, the info and facts around some of these old game devs is pretty misleading. It seems Impulse Games was an internal imprint of Left Field Productions, who produced a bunch of games up until their closure, usually focusing on sports titles. They dabbled in some late 90s and early 2000s Disney games, and their work in the 90s actually led to Nintendo purchasing a minority stake in the company. After working exclusively on Nintendo platforms for a while, they actually bought Nintendo's stake back in 2002, allowing them to release Game of the Year contenders like World Series of Poker on every platform. Hilariously, SpongeBob's Boating Bash is actually a Nintendo exclusive. Released on March 2, 2010, it only hit the Wii for home consoles, alongside a DS port I'll be talking about next. A 360 version was planned based on a leaked prototype found in 2023, but we don't have any definitive info around why it was cancelled. As for why this is a weird entry into the SpongeBob franchise, well, what we have here is essentially SpongeBob meets Demolition Derby. This idea seems slightly violent for a SpongeBob game, but I can't deny that it's a super unique premise for a SpongeBob game. Gotta give them some props for thinking outside of the kart racer space. The actual handling of vehicles is a little sluggish, which I feel like is almost covered up by the ability to drift around corners, or to almost instantly spin your boat around 180 degrees. The team at Impulse Games were clearly at least trying to develop an authentic SpongeBob experience though, because alongside the B button being your accelerator, you also have the A button that acts as a turbo. But this isn't just your regular turbo, because you can press A to activate it whenever you want without a cooldown. Essentially, this is mimicking when SpongeBob would panic during his boating license test and absolutely floor it. In fact, the game literally refers to this action as flooring it. Outside of that, you've also got to pay attention to the damage on your vehicle. Boats are broken up into different parts, with front, back, and middle panels all taking separate damage depending on where a collision occurs. As this happens, the core of your boat becomes exposed, and if you take too much damage to the core of your boat, it'll stop working and that's game over for you. You've also got a roster of characters to choose from, which is mostly for use in quick play. By default, you'll start off with SpongeBob, Patrick, Sandy, and Squidward, and playing through the campaign, you'll unlock Mr. Krabs, Plankton, Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy together, Mrs. Puff, and Seymour, who you probably don't recognize, but you'll be introduced to him in just a moment. While it would have been nice to see a fully fleshed out roster featuring more recurring characters like the Flying Dutchman, Pearl, or Larry, I think they've done a solid job covering the basics. And while they mostly serve as a backdrop rather than being an integral part of things due to the game's Destruction Derby nature, we get to see locations like Glove World, Goo Lagoon, and Rock Bottom as well. While this game is definitely designed to have players spending a lot of time smashing their friends in quick play, the main single player mode, and the only way to unlock all the characters, is via the campaign, which is surprisingly more cinematic than I ever would have expected. The premise for the story is that SpongeBob is trying to get his license yet again, and here you get taken through the basics with Mrs. Puff for your tutorial, which is such a smart and perfect way to ease you into the gameplay. Of course, this all ends up going to shit and SpongeBob fails. As he's wallowing in the misery of yet another failure, The game introduces Seymour Scales, who shows up out of nowhere and promises to teach SpongeBob and get him his license. How will he do this? By making him drive in Destruction Derby, I guess. Seymour tries to justify this by saying he's teaching him exactly what not to do, that way he'll know what he should do when driving. Now, Seymour is supposed to be a scam artist who is doing this to squeeze money out of SpongeBob and co, but the console game does a very poor job of explaining this. The cutscenes just make it seem like he's a weirdo driving instructor until the very end, when it's revealed that he's scamming them. I'm jumping ahead a bit, but the DS version does a much better job at actually revealing that Seymour is taking advantage of SpongeBob. With SpongeBob enrolling into Seymour's program, the campaign is broken up into different lessons that correspond with his patented DRIVE acronym. In each lesson, you have to hit minimum grades to pass and move on to the next, with new boat customization options being gifted to you after passing a lesson. Different boats will be better equipped for different events, although I found that durability was really the only stat that truly mattered. The game presents each letter of the acronym as if they're focusing on a single type of gameplay, but you quickly find that this goes out the window and there's a bunch of crossover. The first lesson is Destruction, and this is your basic Demolition Derby gameplay. Everybody starts in an arena, you get the green light, and everybody just smashes into one another. There's no real strategy here, and it really just plays out like every Demolition Derby game or mode ever made. The one thing I really disliked across the board, but particularly in this game mode, is that you take ridiculous amounts of damage from barely nudging a wall, which is the opposite of fun. Next up we have Recklessness, which introduces a few types of gameplay. First up is a slight tweak on the Demolition Derby gameplay, where instead of just trying to be the last man standing, you're awarded points for damaging other players, and this is used to decide the winner. Next, you get these weird races that aren't really races. Sure, you're doing laps of a course, but to win, you actually need to earn a minimum number of points from smashing other races. Points are literally the only thing that matter here, and you don't get anything for a better finish in the race. I've got no idea why they didn't use finishing position as some sort of points modifier. It means the gameplay here has you awkwardly trying to match pace with everyone else, so you can hit them enough to get the minimum required points to pass. Overall, the race modes, yes, there are multiple, are just really bad in Boating Bash. It's particularly awful to start races. When everybody is bunched up at the starting line, it just turns into this awkward clusterfuck. Lastly, Recklessness also introduces this Battle Royale mode where there is a pit on the outside of the arena that you can knock your opponents into to eliminate them. Outside of that slight tweak, it's the same as the Destruction Derby mode. It's at this point where the game modes sort of dry up and everything that comes next is slight variations of what you've already experienced. Maybe you have to collect parts that fly off of damaged opponents, or maybe players will become stunned when hitting them, leaving them vulnerable for more damage. But they're very minor variations that don't change much of the gameplay. The velocity lesson brings back the racing gameplay, and surprisingly, this is genuine racing, which also badly exposes that this game was not designed with racing in mind. It's embarrassingly easy. I won my first race with ease and lapped half the races, and the iffy handling of the boats is on full display here when you're actually trying to take corners with precision instead of just flying full force into other drivers. There's one track here that is really short, and it kind of makes the gameplay a little bit better as it forces the races to be bunched up more and it ups the destruction gameplay, but it's still a bad experience. Lastly, we've got the escape lesson. Here everybody is specifically ganging up on you and you're required to knock out all of the enemy boats before a time limit runs out. Multiple waves of enemies get sent at you, and depending on how quickly you beat the wave, your boat will be repaired by a certain percentage. Then in the middle of these lessons, it just switches focus to throwing a bunch of random game modes at you, which also coincides with an insane difficulty spike. Up until this point, the game had been laughably easy, but for these final few tests, it feels like they turned the AI up to Super Saiyan God mode, which was extremely jarring. I can only imagine what kids would have felt trying to beat these last few tests. And then that's it for the main campaign, and by extension, the game as a whole. You've experienced all of the game modes in Boating Bash, and if you haven't been turned off by now, I guess you can invite some friends over to play. That would make you a bad friend, but you could do it. Ultimately, I just found most of the game modes to be pretty dull. This really is just a regular ass destruction derby game. You don't have any cool power-ups or major tweaks to the formula to make this truly unique. They added some nice touches of SpongeBob flair to the controls, with the stuff like the floor it button, and I wish they would have done something similar for the actual game modes. There's also very little strategy outside of picking the most durable boat. Why would I pick anything else? Speed and handling are literally irrelevant for anything other than the genuine race game mode, and even then durability is super important. If your boat is destroyed in a race, you lose. After playing through everything that Boating Bash has to offer, my takeaway was that I wish this game was something else. This would have been way better if it was a Burnout style game, or a vehicular combat game, or hell, even if it was just a generic kart racer. The gameplay is so dull and lame that I would have taken a mid-kart racer over this any day of the week. I feel slightly bad trashing SpongeBob's Boating Bash on Wii as much as I am, because it's not an absolute train wreck like some of the other games I've played in Nickelodeon and SpongeBob's history that I would personally consider F tier. But at the end of the day, none of the gameplay is fun. Sure, there's cute moments like the floor it button and Mrs. Puff being used to give the tutorial, and the cutscenes have had genuine effort put into them, but all of that doesn't excuse the fact that I had no fun playing this game. I unfortunately have to slam SpongeBob's Boating Bash on Wii down into F tier. By 2010, it was becoming pretty clear that DS games could match a lot of what was being put out on home consoles, at least when it comes to licensed games. Gone are the days when the home console and handheld versions of what was technically supposed to be the same game would feel like they were developed with zero communication between the two developers. When you look at something like Truth or Square, it shows that the gap had started to shrink. This also applies to SpongeBob's Boating Bash on the DS. While it can't go all out and fully match some of the flashier elements of the Wii version, after having played that game and then coming to the DS, everything just feels familiar. Released on the same day, SpongeBob's Boating Bash for DS was developed by Firebrand Games, who you might recognize from the DS port of Cartoon Network Racing. Across their 19 years of history, they've mostly stuck to making racing games, but they did take a brief break when a truly unmissable project came across their desk: Planet 51 the game. As I mentioned, this game is very similar to the home console version. For starters, the available characters are identical, with the only difference being Squidward is now locked from the beginning. Similarly, the game's locations are pretty much the same, although the DS does get some exclusive ones like the Flying Dutchman's Graveyard and Jellyfish Fields. Being a DS game, there are obviously concessions made in the gameplay, particularly in the controls. You have the luxury of playing Boating Bash via the touchscreen or the face buttons, although the devs mostly promote the touch controls. If you're brave enough to commit to the touchscreen, you'll find that you choose your direction like you're steering a ship, selecting a spot on this big wheel to instantly move your vehicle in that direction. Acceleration is also controlled through this wheel, with touching the outside of the wheel making you go faster, while the inside of the wheel will make you drive slower. This is confusing as hell at first, and the most pressing issue for me was that you need to keep an eye on the touchscreen to make sure you're pressing the right directions and using the desired speed, while also watching the top screen to see what's actually happening. Luckily, Firebrand thought about this, and they included a handy bubble icon that gets overlaid on the top screen, which gives you a decent enough idea of where you're touching on the bottom screen. The wheel on the touchscreen also displays your boat's health. Firebrand really committed to this damn boat wheel. Just like the Wii version, you've got the ability to floor it. This time it's activated by pressing the L or R buttons. I played a solid chunk of this game exclusively with the touchscreen, and the controls are passable. It's an okay experience, definitely usable, but once I made the switch to the face buttons, playing Boating Bash felt a million times better, and there really weren't any reasons why I would switch back. As we jump into the campaign, we get some light voice acting, certainly nothing to the level of the Wii version, but it's nice that this is slowly becoming the standard for SpongeBob's handheld adventures. And yes, the main campaign is once again divided up into 5 different lessons from Seymour via the DRIVE acronym. This is where the most obvious differences are on display. We've got a vastly different perspective, and strangely, there aren't any Destruction Derby arena type modes. Instead, every type of gameplay is set up to be a type of race. Even if the goal is just to wreck your opponents, you never get placed in an arena or anything like that. As you power through the campaign, you'll have races that ask you to just destroy your opponents against the time limit, with a completed lap of the course repairing your boat slightly and adding more time onto the timer. There are genuine time trial challenges where you need to complete a certain number of laps in a time limit. However, the time limit is ridiculously short. To extend the time, you need to hit other races, making for a very weird experience because you basically need to awkwardly hang with the pack so you can build up a big enough time buffer to then actually race. You're essentially penalized for just racing here. My personal least favorite gameplay type was the actual races. Again, they give you a mode where the goal is to just win a race, and while the driving controls respectably, it's immediately ruined by the insane AI rubber banding. I'm not joking when I say you spend the entire race just bunched up with all of the other competitors, and it makes the end result complete luck. I think Firebrand actually realized they messed up because you don't even need to win these to advance. There are so many questionable decisions here. Like when a racer gets destroyed in one of the races, they respawn. Not a terrible decision in isolation, but for some reason Firebrand chooses to make the destroyed racers respawn further ahead on the track. So instead of being a penalty, being destroyed is now a net neutral event at worst, or in the best case scenario, it's actually downright helpful. They also toss in these weird auto drive sections. You'll occasionally see a crazy section like this in Mario Kart or other kart races, but here it's executed terribly because no matter where the racers are positioned, once everybody heads into this section, the game decides to bunch everybody together again. It's especially bad on the Flying Dutchman track because here this auto drive section appears literally 2 seconds before the finish line, making the end results even more of a coin flip than they already were. And overall, I found that the races were just too damn long. There's a snappy pace to all of the other game modes, but when you start a race, you know you're going to be locked in for an eternity, which just sucks considering this is easily the worst game mode to play. Lastly, there's also the escape game mode where all of the other races are W keying you and going out of their way to destroy you while you have to finish a number of laps without being destroyed. This is pretty meh. There really isn't much you can do to avoid being hit, other than just outrunning your opponents as best you can, so it really ends up being pretty lame. In most of the game modes, they include the mechanic of finishing a lap to repair your boat or add some extra time, which would be a nice inclusion if most levels weren't just finished within like 30 seconds, not even remotely giving you a chance to complete a lap. One of the biggest gameplay issues comes from the changed camera perspective. You've got this kind of isometric view and no minimap, which makes anticipating where the track is going a nightmare most of the time. You're just driving blind unless you've already memorized the track, and it helps make the racing just even clunkier than it already was. As I touched on in the Wii version, they actually play up the whole Seymour is a con artist angle a lot more in this version of Boating Bash. Seymour's whole ploy here is to basically scam SpongeBob and his friends out of repair money. He gets them all to enter these events, and then afterwards he charges them a repair cost for the damages they incur. While doing each level, you'll be able to collect money, which offsets the costs, and allows your vehicle to be properly repaired in between events. Naturally, you get to chase down and murder Seymour as the finale to the game, something that also happens in the Wii game, but it feels like it comes out of nowhere in that version. Instead, you've spent the whole game being ripped off by him in the DS, and it makes a lot more sense. Unfortunately, doing these repairs feels like it doesn't matter and has no real consequences. Blowing up just doesn't matter here. As I mentioned earlier, it literally benefits you by pushing you further ahead in the race. Even in your exams that you need to take here, it doesn't matter. In my R exam, I was destroyed, and I just simply got respawned. It does give you a lower grade in certain levels, but it's not something that will have a noticeable impact on your experience. Some levels do operate on a live system, but these are far too generous and make it all irrelevant. By the time you chase down and murder Seymour, you'll have been playing Boating Bash for roughly 90 minutes. I actually did this all in one sitting, and I was a little surprised to see I never got to customize my boat and try to utilize different stats. It actually seemed like the stats would play into the gameplay more here compared to the Wii version. After beating the main campaign, I was pretty shocked to see that actually boat stats do play a role here. Apparently the game locks you into using SpongeBob at the start of the campaign, but eventually you get to choose your character, but only if you exit out and go back into the campaign. With the money you collect in the campaign, you can also purchase new boats, and you actually have to purchase new characters here, rather than being gifted them like in the Wii version. The only bit of replayability I could see this game having comes through this unlocking system. After my first playthrough, I still had quite a lot left to unlock, and by my estimate you'd have to beat the whole thing at least a couple of times to fully unlock everything. Even then, you'd only be getting like 3 hours of gameplay from Boating Bash DS. Again, I've walked away from Boating Bash feeling like making a generic kart racer would have been the better option. The driving controls surprisingly well here, and Firebrand has a deep pedigree in racing games, so I've got no doubts it would have created a better game. In some aspects, this is better than the Wii version, but in some ways it's also much worse. At the end of the day, just like the Wii version, none of the gameplay is actually any fun. I think the decision to make this a destruction derby game really torpedoed the game, and it's a real shame because to this day we haven't received another SpongeBob vehicle-based game. With all that said, it's only fair to have SpongeBob's Boating Bash on DS join its flashier sibling in F tier.
I won't let Mr. Krab down now.
And with that, we've reviewed and ranked the first 24 games across SpongeBob's iconic video game history. Unfortunately, these second batch of games didn't quite hit the mark, and I think a lot of it is coming down to corporate greed. I feel like both THQ and Nick were pushing for cheap and easy cash grabs here, to the point where not even Heavy Iron could replicate what they did with their first two games. Both versions of Truth or Square were still good games, but the home console version in particular could have been so much more. If THQ gave them the time, this could have easily been an A or even S tier game. Atlantis SquarePantis, Drawn to Life, and Beach Party Cook-Off on the DS were all respectable efforts and certainly worth checking out. In general, SpongeBob's time on the DS has been pretty good for the most part. We'll have to see how his transition to the 3DS goes in the next part of this series. Over on home consoles, this was a really disappointing batch of games. Underpants Slam and Boating Bash were the worst of the worst, joining Creature from the Krusty Krab GBA as the first ever F tier SpongeBob games, while Atlantis SquarePantis and Creature from the Krusty Krab were just terrible games, and they were even worse when you consider they were following up 4 consecutive home console games that hit B tier or higher. And we've still got Battle for Bikini Bottom sitting alone in S tier. At this point, can anything catch it? In the next part, I'll be covering the rest of SpongeBob's video game efforts, and looking at what's on offer, I'm thinking only Cosmic Shake, or maybe the newly released Titans of the Tide have a chance to join the licensed game GOAT in S tier. Once again, a massive thank you for tuning into this monster video. If you're obsessed with nostalgic licensed video games from the late 90s and 2000s like me, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Seriously, like 90% of you guys who've watched my past few videos aren't subscribed yet. Just hit the subscribe button and you're not going to be a slave to the algorithm, and you won't miss out on the final part of me playing and ranking every SpongeBob game. And also make sure you leave a comment below letting me know which one of these SpongeBob games I ranked today is your favourite, and hell, even your least favourite. But until next time, later.